Okie dokie. Good morning, everyone. We have two speakers today talking about fruit trees, vegetables, tomatoes, edibles in the garden. Stephen Swain will focus on fruit edibles. After that, Joe Jennings, a former Marin Master gardener and local expert now residing in Washington State, will share more information with us about vegetables and tomatoes. Unfortunately, Joe had a travel commitment this week and pre recorded his lecture. Cinda will also join us to highlight several more ways to get involved with MMG volunteer projects, and then we close the garden gate. We will also take a bit of time at the beginning of this class to focus on earth friendly gardening and ask for your input as to why it's important and what gardening practices can be considered earth friendly. Having a good understanding of what constitutes earth friendly gardening will be important as you move forward with volunteer and outreach work we do as MMG. And Carol, I'm going to add a thought here, if it's not already in, that there's a good section on earth friendly gardening on our website if you have any kind of information that's not sitting well with you. It will be really explained there. Before we begin, I wanted to reintroduce our guest co trainer, Carol Garcia. I and we are happy to have her back again this week.
Hello.
Anything,
Go ahead.
anything to share about your work with Marin Master Gardeners lately, or anything new happening in your garden, Carol?
Well, thank you. Great to be back. Yeah, I continue to once you get out there in the MMG world, there's always people sort of saying, hey, can you help out with this? Let's get you on board to do this. So I've got my fingers in lots of little pies within Master Gardeners, which is great. More leadership stuff right now than I would want. I want to get out in the garden. But on that note, I live in Kentfield. I got my bulbs in sort of about the right time this year, but they're not exactly coming up like all together in this beautiful panoply of color. It's more like the white tulips came up and then the red ones came up, but it's random, but it's still lovely, right? So it's really fun to see how things are sort of popping out in the garden now, before we go into another weekend of rain. So nice to be back.
Finally, I received very positive feedback from the Pruning Guild's journeyman, pruners, about your training session last week. They were very complimentary and noted your eagerness to learn and improve your pruning skills. I have heard from several trainees that they experienced interested in joining the Pruning Guild next year and hope you were able to have your question by the members answered who were present. If not, please reach out via VMS or plan to connect with the Guild at the project fair on April 25th. Okay, Carol.
Okay. So we're going to take about 10 minutes to go through in more depth in earth-friendly gardening, and we wanted to kind of take it as an opportunity to get more feedback from you all. So why earth-friendly gardening matters to all of us. There's a bunch of things we've been learning about. It minimizes pollutants in the air and the water and the soil. Biodiversity is really important, that we're all trying to sort of, key into that. What's another great thing about earth-friendly gardening is it supports pollinators and natural enemies and saves water. And then also, we might not think about it, but it also saves energy. And then improves degraded soil and et cetera, et cetera. So now we're going to go on to where we want to kind of have you all come forth and just put out sort of, quick answers to things that you think fall under these categories. So we'd like to have you, we'll take like the next 10 minutes. We wanted you to come off of mute, turn on your cameras, and throw out your ideas about what you think are examples of EFG practices under these categories. You can shout out your answers, but if it gets too crazy, then raise your hand and we'll try to see if we can, call on you. And you can also put stuff in the chat. So it's basically just more of a, exploratory, trying to have everybody shout out some answers and all that. So for instance, nurture and protect the soil. What are examples of what we do with best practices for nurturing and protecting the soil? Anybody?
Compost.
Yep, compost. Excellent. Any other people want to join in, like some examples?
I would say
Roy.
water.
Yep.
And there's things in the chat.
Okay, you'll have to be monitoring the chat, and then I'm
Okay.
trying to see
So
if
I'm going to say from Lily, compost, compost, compost.
good.
And from Julie, mulch. And let's see. That's a new message. Oh, Joanne says crop rotation.
Yeah.
That was one I didn't think of. Ethan says encourage worms.
Yeah.
Then woo, they're going fast. I'm gonna wait a minute because my eyes are just like, whoa.
This is great.
It is great, finally, to have time to really talk about this.
Okay.
Okay. I did, Ethan, again, I'll say, encourage worms. Vinad, not stomping around on wet soil. True enough. Don't want to disturb those worms. Ethan again, cover crops. Stephen Fisher, minimize the use of pesticides and herbicides. Great, Stephen. Ken, low till. Great. Catherine, and I'll Ehrlich, because we have two, better known as Katie. More natives. Ethan, protect soil from rain. And I'm assuming, Ethan, you mean runoff, which I'm watching on my hill right now. Elaine, cover crop. Donna, plant plants with same watering needs together. Great, Donna. Robin, soil testing before adding stuff. Julie, limited chemical fertilizers. Ethan, enjoy and cherish your soil. Feel it, smell it, taste it if you want. Not my choice personally. But Ian,
You don't want to have a soil cocktail, huh? Okay.
Well, I was going to say there's a lot of toddlers out there that are willing to do the tasting for you. Barbara Lestico, my GPP garden presently has been amended with a layer of cardboard, 3 inches of compost, 3 inches of mulch to an existing clay soil. And what is that procedure called, Barbara? Is there a name for that procedure? Elena Pigeon is rotate your crops. Barbara just answered lasagna, and she is right, which is making me hungry, which means if I have lasagna, I can have red wine. Vinod, sheet mulching. I'm going to make that a tongue twister.
Yeah. So good. So I think we'll move on to the next one. So those are all great concepts. So anything else we want to add with respect to choosing plants with care? Same thing. I think this putting in the chat and Melissa reading out is great because that streamlines us a little bit. Okay. So we've got some answers starting to come in using natives.
I was just taking a sip of my drink.
Okay, so Linda was saying use natives, so yes.
Okay, let me go down. Choose native plants. Yep. Going down. Ditto to all of the above from Kathleen. Linda used natives. And Elaine, right plant for right spot. Perfect. Olaire, pollinator friendly plants. Gail, native and low wukuls.
We love that WooCoals list. That's great. Yep.
Then look for desired sun exposure on nursery tag. Really a good point. Olaire, right plant for right place. Lily, hydrozones, plants with similar water needs. Barbara, Lesko, all native and drought resistant plants. Charles Bailey, look for low water plants. And Katie, natives want native soil, not fancy amended stuff. Good point. I don't know who this is because it's coming up Peter.
Laura.
Okay.
Laura.
Yep.
Laura to everyone. Drought resistant and natives. Robin, really investigate plants before buying plants. Joanne, healthy roots, white, not coming out of the pot, not circling the pot. And collect runoff. Robin, look for.
You go through the rest of those and then we'll need to move on to the next two. So, but this is great.
Look for pest resistant cultivators.
Cultivars.
And choose disease resistant plants. Okay, that's it.
Okay. So, yeah, conserve water. We'll just have maybe a few answers on that. And then we'll move on.
Match water system to plant needs, capture rainwater. Whoops. Mulch, really good. Linda, water harvesting and mulch was from Lily. Joanna, mulch, 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 mulch. Elaine, don't overwater. Unless you want to pull roots.
Okay, and then let's move on to protect wildlife and the environment.
Deborah, prioritize carbon sequestration, avoid pesticides. Wow, you guys are incredible with this. Include plants to attract pollinators.
And no toxics, as Laura's saying above her. Yep.
Oh, thank you. I was just thinking we should print this out and take it to our meeting.
Well, yeah, you'll save the chat and it'll be there, so that'll be great.
Yeah. That's why I got lost.
I think we should just use this list in lieu of the final.
Well, that'll get your answer. That'll get your answer on maybe a few of the questions, but you might have to.
You know what, Ethan? I would vote for that because that would cut April 26th for me. My day would be so much shorter and I could see my grandchild.
Let's put it to
So
a
I
vote.
vote for that.
There you go. All right, I'm just going to do the last one and then we're going to move on because we want to get to Steve's
Okay.
presentation. But this is great. And so Kathy was saying my California scrub jay nesting pair are eating hundreds of caterpillars from my oak trees. Cool. So anyway, y'all, thank you. That was really great. So I'm going to proceed with the slides. But basically we've kind of covered all this. You've probably so you've seen this handout, I think, where it sort of says by the topics we just discussed, some of the things that we're looking at for earth-friendly gardening. So I'm just going to move through it. Sorry, I tried to get the font to be the same between the two slides and gave up. So anyway, I think just wrapping up, we've been, we're learning all these best practices for creating these sustainable landscapes. And so it's sort of for the benefit of the broader environment, but also to make things easier for gardeners too, right? So if we adopt these practices, then we're more successful in our gardens. And we've also then helped to make beautiful places that for us and for generations to come. So thank you very much. That was a really good sort of dive into earth-friendly gardening. And with this, I'm going to then stop sharing, and then we're going to have Stephen pull up his presentation, and we're going to go forward on that. And as a preface, Stephen always has tons of stuff to tell us, right? So he's got this slide deck that has a lot. So he's basically going to do what he can in an hour and 15, and it'll all be wonderful. So there you go.
Shall I share now?
Yes, go for it.
Okay.
Yeah, and after Stevens, we'll go ahead and take a 15-minute break. So.
Okay, are you guys seeing the title slide now?
We're
Yeah.
not seeing it in we're seeing with your slide deck on the left side too. So we need to.
Okay, so let's try that again.
So you should be able to click on that top thing on the left where it looks like
It says from beginning.
click it again.
I did. Anything, it's not changed on your end, is it?
Nope, that's fine. You can just,
Yeah, it's been one of those mornings with technology, so let's not worry about it and proceed.
Okay, so you guys know who I am. Fruit trees are a world of their own. So we're just jumping straight in. One of the funny things about fruit trees is they are really heavily bred, like many commercial crops, but unlike some horticultural selections. And the selection process in this has been going on since prehistory. They've been able to determine that some of the figs that people carried around with them that they find the seeds of in campfires actually are parthenocarpic. So so that means people were picking at least fig trees as a horticultural crop before the first cities were established. Like we're talking before 10,000 BC. So so that means that some of these crops, these fruit trees in particular, are one of the oldest domesticated things, period. And so since they're perennials, again, like many crops, they've been bred for production, and insect and disease resistance is sometimes secondary because if you, let's just look at it from a sort of market perspective, doesn't matter if you've got something that is insect and disease resistant. If the fruit isn't delicious, people aren't going to buy it. They're going to go for something else. So they've been bred for production. They've been bred for fruit, for delicious fruit, and they are now prolific enough to hurt themselves. At least some of them, not figs, not citrus so much, but certainly things in the rose family. And they're not necessarily the world's most pest-resistant trees. Most trees, the upshot of this is that most trees don't need pruning to stay healthy, but fruit trees are often an exception to this rule. Okay, so to start with, we always start with the soils in this class, and that's no different here. We're not going to spend much time on it other than to say there's this conception that tree root growth mimics the top growth. And while this is true for one or two very, very rare tree species, it really isn't true for the vast majority of them. So most trees have a root system that at least conceptually looks like this. In other words, it's about 3 times the canopy diameter. Most roots are in the top 12 inches. There are a few tap or sinker roots that do go down deeper depending upon the soil and the tree species in question. But even this is a bit idealized when people have actually excavated the trees to look at the root systems, this is what they found. Now, granted, this is in Russia, where in a very deep alluvial soil, so we have a lot of tree roots going down over 10 feet into the soil. But at least when you look at it in a elevation view on the left and a plan view on the right, we see that the root system's very unevenly distributed. And this is probably true for most trees. The depth of the rooting will occur depending on the soil primarily, and a little bit to the tree's genetics. I'm not saying they don't play a role. It's a dance between them. But where the roots end up is going to be part of this dance. It's very it's somewhat unpredictable. Shallow soils are going to have shallow root systems. Deep soils are going to have deep root systems. And that distribution from a plan view can be any one of any number of different potential things. So, so that's as much as we're going to talk about roots. Well, actually, we're going to get into root stock a little bit later. But seasonally, the growth of roots, shoots, and fruit, especially in winter dormant trees, like almost everything in the rose family. I know loquats are an exception, and there's a few others. But we end up with these very seasonal, seasonally distinct growth pattern, where the energy that the tree is expending tends to go into the roots into the winter in the winter time. Whereas in the spring, it's focused really heavily on flowering. So that's that dotted line you see that says shoots. You're seeing a little bit of, I'm sorry, that's the dashed line you see in the fruit section, where you're seeing a bulge of the beginning, and that's the flower section. And then as the flowers become pollinated and they start setting fruit, you see that fruit, it takes more and more energy right up until sometime in the summer or fall, depends upon the fruit tree in question, where it drops off at fruit harvest. The shoots, however, are going in the spring. So you can see you've got a lot of energy inputs going through into the spring, where you have multiple things all happening at once. And then the summer, it really slacks off. Most of the energy goes into the fruit, and it goes back into recharging the tree. Okay, so that's what's happening energetically in terms of how a fruit tree, this is why pruning in the spring is really not a good idea. The tree already has a ton of things it's trying to pull off with energy. The pruning is best done in the winter when the energy demands are quite low, or perhaps in the late summer. Okay, so another critical thing about fruit trees that sets them off from most other trees is this. So that previous slide, this is probably true for most trees, regardless of what, this is true for almost any tree, regardless of whether it's a fruit tree or not. With citrus, you'll see some different things. It's fruiting at different times. But the chilling requirement is, while it's also true for a lot of different trees, we can ignore it for the most part because we're not growing them for fruit. But we have to really pay attention to this. And the chilling requirement is something that's primarily there in the rosaceous. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. Mostly we're going to be talking about all of our rose family fruit trees. So all of our stone fruits and our pome fruits and a few other things along those lines. At the end of this day, if we have time, we'll get in a little bit of citrus. But chilling requirements. The technical definition of chilling requirements is it's the number of hours between 32 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit required by a fruit species or a variety between November 1st and February 15th. That is the technical definition that almost everybody's using. There is a problem with this, though. There's a number of problems with them. First of all, prior to World War II, it was just the number of hours below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you were in North Dakota and you registered your number of chill hours that a fruit tree had, the number would be massive because North Dakota spends a lot of time in the winter below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. But it turned out sometime around, sometime in the early 20th century, they figured out that actually you're not picking up any chilling hours if it's below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. because it's below freezing. So the tree isn't counting those. So when they figured this out, they started revising the chill hours, but you'll find some numbers that were developed on some of these older varietals that, they say they need 1,000 hours of chilling. And it's like, what? Is that real? And the problem is those numbers have changed. Now, for the most part, that's gone now. Unfortunately, we've gotten some new stuff that's also gone into making this confusing. And that is, in the 60s and 70s, they started figuring out, gosh, actually, when you get really close to 32, it only counts for half a chill hour when you're registering a chill hour. So they got more and more nuanced with the model. And so it starts creating some potential issues for us when we read the chill hours on some varieties. So just be aware that these chill hours are broad general guidelines. And especially for some older varietals, there may be some discrepancies between what they list and what we have here. What we experience in Marin and how those trees will perform in Marin, because some of these were developed in other parts of the world where at least the nation, where they had a very different climate than we do. So anyway, the accounting on chill hours is weird. So what happens if you don't meet your chilling hour requirement? A lack of chill hours can result in bud kill and extended bloom and/or poor fruit set, because chill hours are how the tree tells when winter is over. So if you plant a variety that is not well suited to Marin in terms of its chill hours, it will either wake up too early, and that's pretty rare, and it will meet its chill hours before winter's really over. Most things don't have that problem. Most varieties have the problem of waking up too late or never waking up at all. And we saw this not too long ago, even with other trees, like frontier elm, for instance, was planted by some people in the East Bay in San Francisco. And it really requires quite a few chill hours for it to realize winter's over. And in one of these really warm years we had in the while, they didn't pick up enough chill hours to wake up. So they just stayed dormant all summer long and eventually died in their sleep, if you will. And that we usually don't have problems with that, but I have seen, I forget which apple variety it was that was planted in Belvedere not too long ago, that was a high chill hour varietal. It never woke up because they picked a high chill hour varietal in an environment that just doesn't pick up that many chill hours, because Belvedere is too close to the bay and it doesn't drop down below. So it can be a problem. So how do we figure out? We have a lot of what environment we're in and how to select a fruit tree. We have a lot of microclimates in Marin, but almost all of Marin gets more than 400 hours of chill hours every year. So don't pick 1,000 or 1,200 chill hour apple and expect it to do well in Belvedere. If you pick a 500 or 600 chill hour apple, it'll probably get what it needs. And if you pick something that only needs 300 hours of chill, you almost definitely get what you need. If you want to figure out what your microclimate is, there are a number of different ways. One place you can go is to the home orchard at ucdavis.edu, listed right here on the slide. This has lists. However, also be aware, this is based on a couple of CIMIS stations that are on the east side of Marin. If you're on the west side of Marin, your chill hours are going to be different than what they list for Marin. Sonoma County has some weather stations that are on the west side of Sonoma County, and your climate on the west side of Marin is going to be closer to the climate on the west side of Sonoma County. So if you're in Inverness, Point Reyes Station, maybe even Nicasio, places like that, you might want to look at Sonoma County chill hours, try to figure out what kind of chill hours you're getting in West Marin, and go by extrapolating from there. Going from there, it'll probably be more accurate than using San Rafael or Novato's CIMIS station data. If you have questions on that, come talk to me. We can go into it further. Okay, a word about sunlight requirements. All fruit trees are energy intensive. They need water, they need plenty of sunlight, and that is a minimum of 6 hours of sunlight per day. And that's true for citrus and for rosaceous fruit trees. However, there's a big difference, just to mention it now. Citrus are evergreen, so they need 6 hours of sunlight per day on December 21st. And that is a challenge for a lot of locations that might be on, say, the north side of a mountain with some forest around it, that kind of idea. Rosaceous trees are dormant and they don't care how much and many hours they're getting on December 21st because none of them are in leaf except loquats. So they care about getting 6 hours per day when they're in leaf. So if you've got loquats, you need to pay attention to December 21st. For the rest of them, you need 6 hours per day when it's in leaf, which is, say, March, which is much easier to meet. So you need 6 hours per day starting around the spring equinox or something like that. So if you don't have those, think about maybe going for something other than fruit trees, because all fruit trees require a pretty intensive amount of energy to be able to produce a decent crop of fruit, because there's a lot of sugar in those fruits. Okay, pollination of fruit trees. So we need to get a little bit technical here. There's a difference between a pollinizer and a pollinator. A pollinator is an insect, usually a bee, but for, say, pears, it's flies also, that carry pollen from one tree or flower to another. A pollinizer is a tree of one variety used to provide pollen to a nearby tree, usually of a different variety in order to produce fruit. So let's talk about a little bit about this. We'll use cherries as an example. Pollinizer varieties required for sweet cherries. And we're just going to look at this really quickly. So the variety that you're trying to pollinize or pollinate is Bing and Lambert, right? If we've got a Bing or Lambert tree, the pollinizers we can use are black tartan, Van, and Rainier. You'll notice that Bing and Lambert are not self-fertile, so they need a different pollinizer available for them to provide pollen. And they're kind of a little bit choosy about who that is. Some of this just has to do with the trees that actually cross over when they're flowering. If you have a tree that you're trying to get pollinized and it blooms in February and your pollinizer blooms in April, you got a problem, because you're never going to get any fruit from that pollinizer to go to that tree. So any pollen from the pollinizer to get to the tree, because the windows of bloom simply do not overlap. But there's also such a thing as self-incompatibility, where the variety is so closely related to the pollen is so closely related to the tree you're trying to pollinize that it's like, no, that's my own pollen. I won't take that. That I need to cross. So that's why this compatibility issue arises. So, it's interesting. We can look at Rainier, for instance, and it'll take quite a few various different pollinizers. Royal Anne tends to be fairly, and it's just the name, but it tends to be fairly selective in the varieties. It will only take Van or black tartan, right? But then you look at black tartan and Van and what they will cross with, and it's all different varieties. So these are very much, black tartan and Van are sort of universal pollinizers, as would be potentially ornamental cherries. They are so distantly related to a lot of these things, they should also work well as a pollinizer. And then Les Pins and Stella, you don't have to worry about it. So you can buy a cherry variety that is self-fruitful and will work well. So there's an example. You can say the same thing for a bunch of different pears and apples and things along these lines. Now, maybe, so this presents some kind of a little bit of a problem. We would need to look up the variety we have. And if you don't know the variety you have, say your grandmother left you a cherry tree and now it doesn't seem to be, or you took a cutting off of it, you grafted it, you moved it someplace else, but you have no idea what it is. How do you deal with that? Well, you can go to the California Rare Fruit Growers, or you can do this. You can simply look, if it's an apple, for instance, which is what these are, that is blooming, you can look for other apple trees that are blooming at the same time and just see if you can grab a a graft from those other apple varietals and cut it, bring it home, stick it in a vase, prop it up in your tree or at the base of your tree even. And that's all you often need, is just for the bees to be able to get a little bit of pollen from these things to really boost, to really set off production. And if that works, you can go back to that same tree that you found that was on the side of the road or whatever in your neighbor's yard and take another snipping off of it, root it, and plant it in your garden. Or you can graft it into the tree if you want to. There's a bunch of different ways you can do this, but there are ways to make sure you get what you, ways to make sure, ensure a good fruit crop. Okay, so that's enough about pollinators and pollinizers. Let's talk a little bit back to the dirt about soil requirements for fruit and nut trees. So for most of these, again, these are rosaceous, not citrus. The optimum depth is about 3 to 5 feet of good topsoil is what you want. That's hard to get in Marin. You can get it some places. If you're in downtown Ross, you're sitting on alluvial soils. You've got some nice, deep, rich soils. But if you're on a hillside or on a top in Marin, particularly around Tiburon and Belvedere, you don't have anywhere near that. You'll be lucky to get 1 to 2 feet of decent soil. And you may not have that. You may end up getting to a point where you can plant these in 6 inches. Yeah, so the minimum depth, we say 1 to 2 feet. My mother has proved this incorrect. She does have a number of fruit trees on serpentine soils with about 4 to 6 inches of soil. They are really small trees, even to this day. That's been 10 years. And she does get a little bit of fruit, but so what we're saying is soil requirements to be able to produce a decent crop. So I would say my mom's proved this wrong. The trees will survive on less, but they won't really thrive. So this is for thriving. So very quickly, planting fruit trees, this is usually done bare root, and I really like bare root. What we've illustrated here is a ball and burlap scenario. You want to plant your fruit trees, especially if you have clay soils and especially if you're on flat, you want to make sure that tree is planted slightly high. Pears are the only one of the rosaceous fruit trees that really can tolerate much in the way of flooding. A lot of the rest of them will not handle that well, especially if you're on clay soils and they're flat. So try to plant a little bit high. If you can't do a mound system like this for some reason, raised beds will also work. However, one of the mistakes you do not want to make, and I've seen it done here in Novato, you do not want to put soil amendments beneath the root ball. That's because those soil amendments will break down. And so the tree will eventually sink as those soil amendments break down. And you do not want a tree that is sitting deep in the hole. Most fruit trees will not tolerate that. So what do you do? None in the planting hole, but you should backfill to the native. That's what this dotted line is across the bottom that's sort of talking about soil level. We don't even want soil amendments in that. You can get away with it, but you don't want anything beneath where the ball and burlap is, or if you have to, the bare root. It's illustrated as ball and burlap, but a bare root follows these same rules, basically. Better place for if you want to amend soil is to put it up in this part above the dotted line that is back, sort of the mounded soil that sits above the soil line. If the amendments break down there, yes, it'll subside, but you can just fill it with more amendments and the tree will still be quite happy by keeping up on your mulching around the base of around the root system of the tree. Obviously not right at the base of the tree. We've covered that. If you want to really amend the soil and you want to rototill or something like that, you really need to do that before the tree goes in, like preferably a year before the tree goes into the soil. And you want to avoid pockets of uncomposted organic matter in heavy soils. That's sort of a recipe for rotting materials rather than anaerobic conditions. So as you work the over time, you want to add mulch and compost to the surface. You don't want to necessarily work it in. Okay, so we're going to talk about a lot of different fruit tree terms today. And so just so that we're all on the same page, I know most of you are familiar with this stuff, but when we talk about the root stock, or we just say you get a stock that is this is the tree below the graft union, because most fruit trees are grafted onto disease-resistant or dwarfing root stock, one or the other, and we'll get back into that a little bit later too. So that's what we're talking about when we say root stock or stock. The scion is the opposite. It's the part above the graft union. It's the part that we want to keep. It's the part that produces the fruit. So the fruit is dependent on the quality of the fruit, and the type of fruit is all dependent on the scion. So the term crown, you may hear me use a number of times. I try to not use that. That we're going to mostly use that for talking about the root crown, the trunk below the ground, or where you'll just start to see the flare at soil grade. Some people also use this for the canopy of the tree. I will try to avoid using that. When I want to talk about the canopy, we'll talk about the canopy. So there's a little bit of ambiguity in the literature here, and people use it in different ways, which is one of the reasons I try to not be ambiguous, because it gets really messy. Okay, some other things that we're going to talk about in terms of fruit trees. We can talk about a standard tree. Now, standard fruit trees that are not dwarfed or semi-dwarfed typically grow to around 20 to 25 feet. That is typically. Some standard trees, particularly, native apples, like you'll see in the apple trees, the ones we've all picked are native to sort of Central Asia, Afghanistan, and those regions right in there. And some of them will hit, 60 feet tall. And I've seen some that were 60 feet tall that were grown in the mountains of Santa Cruz. So they are here in the Americas on their own root stock. But most grafted trees are on dwarfing or semi-dwarfing root stocks. And so this is how you can keep a standard tree to a much smaller size that is much more manageable. So root stocks are chosen for their dwarfing characteristics many times and for their disease resistance characteristics, which is why there are so many trees that are planted on these root stocks, because nobody wants to climb 25 feet up in the air to try and harvest their apples or clean the rotting apples that didn't get harvested because they're so high up in the tree, and that gets to be a bit of a problem. So semi-dwarfing, or dwarfing rootstocks can hit somewhere between 12 to 20 feet, which is much more manageable in terms of size. And then you can get things called genetic dwarfs. These are where the entire tree is dwarfing. It's not just the rootstock. And these will often only grow to 8 to 12 feet, which is really very ideal for a lot of different things. And there are genetic dwarfs available for peaches, genetic dwarfs available for nectarines, not surprisingly, since they're just a form of peach. And for apple, and even for some citrus trees. So what does a genetic dwarf look like? Well, here, oh, come on, really? Yeah. So we've got a genetic dwarf of a peach or nectarine here in flower and in leaf. So these are a lot easier. They require a lot less work. But if you've got deer, these can be a liability as well. So there are upsides and downsides to having trees of various different sizes, and you're just going to have to pick what works well for your location. The difference here is illustrated here. On the left, we have a standard peach, and on the right, we have a genetically dwarfed peach. And what you can see is that the internode length for a given leaf size is about half of what it would normally be in a regular tree. So this is where the dwarfing is occurring, and it's throughout the plant, not just on a root stock. Okay, some other fruit tree terms that we're going to be talking about. Scaffolding branches. These are main structural limbs, and these are often chosen by the people who, if you're doing things right, these are chosen by the horticulturalist. to depending upon the structure that they're looking for. A spur is a short fruiting twig. It's a fruit spur. And these spurs will also produce some, in many instances, leaves, but particularly on apple and pear varietals, and to some degree cherries, they will produce the majority of the flowers are going to be on these short fruiting twigs. Oops. Then the shoot is the current season's elongated growth. Now, often the shoots, matters a lot for pruning. And the shoots, we can tell often by the bark color on the twigs that are growing. You can also look for a ring scar from previous year's terminal buds. That's illustrated here in the middle of this image on the right. You can see the ring of bud scale scars. And those bud scale scars show you where the last year's growth was. And that can be really useful for figuring out how you want to make your pruning cuts. We can't get too far into fruit tree pruning. It is a world unto its own again. So that if you really want to do that kind of stuff, there's Pruning Guild has some options. Edibles Guild, I think, may also have some options in terms of offering you more in-depth pruning work. There's the terms internode and node. I'm pretty sure we're all familiar with those. Water sprout is a term used for, so a lot in the lay public, you will often find people talking about these water sprouts as suckers because they call anything that is growing up rapidly. Technically, these are water sprouts. The only things that are suckers come from the root stock or the roots of a tree, technically. Now, this is a great way to kill a conversation if you start correcting people at parties about their terms and water sprouts and suckers. So I'm not saying, for my own part anyway, when people say, oh, I got these suckers coming up from the tree, I don't bother, unless they're master gardeners, I don't bother usually correcting that stuff. Just because I know what they're talking about and they're just using the terms, but among us, those of us in the know, it'd be better to use these. It's so much clearer when you say sucker versus water sprout. Now we know what you're talking about. I hope I made that clear. Suckers, root tissue only. Water sprouts are scion tissue only. Spurs. These are what all the fruiting is about on the trees. So on cherries, you can get fruiting spurs. On apricot, you can get fruiting spurs. On pear, Asian pear and European pear, these are what they look like. They have these much bigger, fatter buds that are, and they're clustered in these particular groups. Now, not all trees produce fruit on spurs, though. For instance, peaches all produce fruit on first-year wood, and so they're going to have the vegetative bud in the middle, and they're going to, well, at least on these peaches, and the flowering buds are going to be off to either side. And the flowering buds will open up first, and followed by the vegetative buds later. So this is how you're going to look at trees, figure out what they're budding on, and that's going to direct a lot of your pruning choices. We'll get back to that in a little bit, though, because we haven't even put the trees in the ground. So let's talk about choosing and handling fruit trees. There are a lot of reasons, good reasons, to buy bare root trees rather than potted trees. This isn't to say you can't use either, don't get me wrong, but bare root trees are cheaper, for one, because they're so much easier to transport, and you can see the root structure and make sure it's not screwed up from day one. Whereas where you buy potted trees, the soil clustered around that root system hides all the sins of anybody who handled this earlier, and you don't know. So I generally, even if I buy a potted tree, wash all the soil off so I can make sure we don't have circling roots or something that happened at the 1 gallon size before I plant them out, because I don't want to have my client come back to me and say, my trees are really not doing well. And I'll say, well, gosh, I don't know why, because I didn't, look at this. And you don't want that in your yard either. When you generally want to pick trees that are not too big, about 1/2 inch to 5/8 inch caliper on the stem. And these trees, while they are dormant, they're still alive and they still need water. And we do not want them to dry. They don't need to be planted in water. They don't want that, but they want to be kept cool and moist during the winter, just like they would be in nature. So we need to make sure that they are properly treated until we plant them. And here's the rub. We really want to, if you want your best selection of bare root trees, that's usually available in the late fall to early winter, but you may not have time or energy or desire, whatever, to plant right then, which means you can't just stick them in your garage and hope that they make it. You kind of want to plant them outside where they're going to get occasional rain and that kind of stuff, but you don't want them breaking dormancy either. You'd like to plant them in a shady spot where they're not going to wake up too early, but where they're going to be able to breathe and they're going to be able to the root systems are going to stay moist. The way you deal with this is you heal them in. So you pick a shady spot in your garden, which shouldn't be hard to find in the winter, and you're going to plant them at an angle, which will mess with their ability to sense what's up and all kinds of stuff. And it basically keeps them dormant for longer. And you're just going to temporarily plant them at that angle in the shade until you're ready to move them. And this will allow them now to survive. For if you're going to have to hold on, this is mostly something they use where they've got really long winters. You could use them here in Marin if you're going on vacation. You buy them in November and you just want to wait until February to plant. That's all fine. If you're going for just keep it for a couple weeks, yeah, you can probably stick them in a moistened burlap bag in your garage on their side, and that will work out fine too. But you can't keep them there that way for a really long time. Okay, so when you plant fruit trees, the first thing you're going to do, regardless of whether you buy bare root or potted plants, you're going to check the roots and cut off anything that is dead, damaged, disoriented. It's basically the 4 Ds, right? You shouldn't find anything that's diseased, ideally. I mean, if you do, that asks a bunch of questions about where you're getting your stock from. The hole size that you dig for these trees should be wide. And you can make it deeper than the soil if the soil is compacted, but hopefully you're not planting in compacted soils. I think that's a rare occurrence. You want to plant it slightly high or in a mound to keep the crown dry. Less of a concern with pears, but still a concern if you're in a very frequent flood area. Plant high. This reduces the chances of crown rot and root rot. And you want the root crown just below, just at or below ground, and the graft union well above the soil. So we'll go into that in keep in mind, especially if you dig deep on compacted soils, that the soil will settle. And so the plant will drop a little bit. So a deep hole is a grave. And I am amazed at the number of people who do not follow this advice, including people who should know better and people who've been told. Dig a wide hole. If you need to check for this level, that's what this board is doing. The bottom of that board is at soil level. So if the bottom of the board is below the top of the soil in your hole, in your pot, which it looks like it is just barely here, that means you've got about the right height there. So planting a bare root tree, you're going to sort of hold it there at the right level. If ideally you haven't dug the soil too much deeper. If you have, then you need to backfill with native soil, no amendments. Press it down with your foot before you even put that tree in the soil. Once you've got it to an area where the roots seem like they're sort of settling in, then you can backfill, tamp it down lightly, and then fill it all the rest of the way in, tamp it again, and then put your emitters so that they're right at the edge of where that root system is. Do not install permanent irrigation here. You're gonna have to move that irrigation. So I really like drip or my preferred methodology for this, because it is micro sprinkler arrays on a movable line at the top of soil, which we cover with a little bit of mulch. Planting a containerized tree is fairly similar. You're supposed to pull out the circling roots. On a plant that looks like this, where you don't see a lot of roots circling around, that doesn't cause you, Maybe you feel lucky and you think you can get away with it. I don't anymore after looking at enough trees that were root bound even inside of that pot. So because they had been root bound at the 1 gallon level, this is a 5-gallon pot. So I always rinse off all the soil on a tree I'm transplanting and check to make sure I don't have a messed up root system, which makes it basically more work and time than even a bare root soil is, which is why I kind of like bare roots. They're less effort and you're paying a premium for this the privilege of doing more work. But you can plant from a containerized tree. You basically just pull the roots out, water it in, don't cover the soil in the pot, water it in, and you're good to go. Typical post-planting care is that for most trees, you're going for a lot of trees, not necessarily all, especially stone fruits tend to be pruned into an open vase configuration. Apples and pears, sometimes a modified central leader. I'll get into what those are in a minute. So you might consider heading the tree at 18 to 36 inches. You may not. That depends on what you're looking for. But a lot of time, that's what you're going to do. This is brutal. I'll show you pictures of that in a minute. Cut back to well-spaced laterals, 3 to 8 inches apart. Remove all the others. You might consider, if you're in a hot summer area, to paint the trunk white. Whitewash interior latex paint and water 50-50. Either one works. Whitewash is preferred since it breaks down into soil nutrients. Interior latex dries to basically plastic. Not hurting anything really since it's such a little amount, but you're not really helping the tree much with it either, other than it reflects sunlight. We do have a problem with sunburning of newly planted trees. That's why you're doing this. If you're in an area that gets a lot of intense summer sun, this is something you probably want to do, particularly with cherries and some of the other stone fruits that might go dormant and can potentially sunburn their first year. Less of a problem with loquats and things along those lines. Not impossible though. You want to paint, if you're doing this on young trees, you want to paint the entire trunk and 2 inches below soil grade, and it prevents sunburn and borers. Big problem, again, on cherries. So what does this look like? Yeah, question.
So we have about a half an hour left. So may I suggest that we skip the pruning type of slides since they can get that from the pruning guilds?
Okay, sounds good. The pruning slides will go fairly quickly anyway, so we may just barely touch on them. Typical orchard style pruning of a bare root tree looks something like this. For very thin whips, you'll just do this. For trees that already have some established scaffolding that are sizable and have fruiting spurs on them, then we may leave the first few things and take some of those off later if we want to. New shoots and branches on our newly planted tree. It looks like this when we prune it, and it looks awful, but it'll come out looking a lot better. So orchard style pruning of a bare root tree, if we're going for a central leader, is going to look something like this, modified central leader. If we're going for open vase, this is what it's going to look like. Your beautiful new orchard looks pretty hacked. So the idea, there are a lot of different ways to prune. This is an example of some of the simple V's. This is used when you've got a lot of fruit trees planted very close together, pretty intensive culture. But this is basically your open vase structure on the left. And that's what we're aiming for a lot of things. Post-planting irrigation. You want to water in. If the soil's at all dry, you want to water in immediately after planting. This helps settle the soil, helps you figure out how well the tree's going to settle in. But in heavy soil, you don't want to do this if the water is still wet, because you can end up with anaerobic conditions and dead roots. Drip emitters, depending upon the size of your root ball, 1 to 3 feet away from the trunk, or a donut basin around the tree. The best is drip and micro sprinkler irrigation, but you can use anything to make it work. The worst situation is in a lawn. I have seen people still make that work though. Water should reach at least 2 feet deep. However, you're not going to be able to check that. I don't know anybody that digs a hole 2 feet deep to check just the watering. So you will want to water to about 1 foot deep, figure out how much time it took to do that. double that amount, to figure out how much time it took to get to 1 foot deep, double that time, that'll give you 2 feet deep. Do be aware you're going to have to change watering a lot as this tree matures. A 2-year-old tree will use about 2 gallons a day. A mature tree can use in excess of 50 gallons a day. There's a curve or at least a slope to that. So you're going to have to increase water availability as the tree increases in size. And you're going to have to move the emitters as the tree increases in size, which is why I do not recommend permanent irrigation in an orchard environment. So drip irrigation tends to apply the same water at the same points over and over again. I'm not a huge fan of this. I prefer micro sprinklers, but you will see the roots going to that point. The problem is they're not applying a lot of water to other areas. Micro sprinklers tend to look more like this. They apply the water over a bigger area, but you also have much bigger evaporative losses in this system, which means you have to make sure you time your irrigation to minimize evaporative losses, which is typically about 5 a.m. Okay. Fertilization. Most fruit trees don't need much in the way of fertilization, especially nitrogen. Nitrogen can actually be counterproductive to fruit production. So we don't want to use more than about 1 pound of nitrogen in a year in any. Too much nitrogen means excessive leaf growth, shading of lower wood. Other nutrients in the soil are usually sufficient. If you're worried about it and you don't want to spend a lot of time and money fussing with it because you think you're probably okay, you can use organic amendments, things like composts, and those will probably suffice. If you are worried about it, which you should be in Tiburon, Belvedere, or any place with serpentine soils, then you should probably do a soils test, figure out what you're shy on, what you need to add, and go from there. And then you can backfill with organic amendments, which will also help. So we're going to make some very, very quick, just barely touch on these pruning issues. Obviously, these are the basics. You can get much more advanced if you want to. So some quick definitions. Heading cut is the removal of a part or shoot that's used to promote branch development. For the most part, we're not doing this. It is used in winter pruning of dormant trees. When you make a cut here, it has effects that you need to be able to anticipate to use this well. The dotted line here represents your ring scar of the last year's growth. So when you start cutting into second year growth, you can see you are cutting back to second year growth. You're going to see effects depending upon exactly how you choose this, how you choose your pruning cuts. So the thinning cuts are used to remove thinning cuts are not the same as a heading cut. These are used to remove entire branches or shoots. These are generally done to open the tree canopy up. They're a little bit easier to predict and control. And so these are what mostly we'll be using, but not always. So, and you guys can dive into that a little bit deeper. We will also want to be very concerned with structure. This is a big issue on young fruit trees. We do not want to have narrow angle crotches. They tend to have included bark, as you can see here on the left, and that means very poor attachment points. We want to have wider angles on these, about 45 degrees or so. So that's good. 90 degrees is not necessarily that much better than 45, though. So as long as we don't have bark trapped in that crotch right there, you're in good shape. If you're worried about it, it's the easiest to train when you're working with young trees, right? So a lot of these kinds of issues can be avoided just with minimal effort. Clothesline clips can push branches that are competing and too close together. You can move them apart just with that. You can use stakes and pull them down, or my favorite way of doing this is taking the prunings that you've already cut notches in them and use them to wedge branches outwards so that they have a preferred. These, yes, they might fall out in high winds later in the season, but as long as the tree has begun putting on new growth, by the time that happens, yeah, you're still okay. And I kind of like it when they fall out because that means I don't have to take them out. Okay, winter versus summer pruning. Trees are programmed when they're in leaf. So the trees figure out what they want to do in terms of their next year's growth pattern when they still have leaves on them. And that means they are programming themselves in the summer. And if we prune in the summer, what we see is what we get. They will have time to make adjustments for that. They will rejigger their own programming. Winter pruning stimulates growth for remaining buds. It's a little harder to do. So, and heading cuts do this especially. Varietals vary in their responses. Pears are notoriously vigorous in their responses. So are plums. They can make things very difficult for anticipating how things go. Thinning cuts are less so. So 1 point here, pruning apricot and cherries. Do not do this in the winter. You used to be able to get away with this in Marin. There is a disease called eutypa. It's now in Marin, and it's prevalent enough that if you prune your apricots or your cherries in the winter, you risk getting eutypa. And eutypa is fatal if you don't stop it in time. And stopping it in time can be a challenge because by the time you see bleeding on the outside, it's already worked its way substantially down into the tree. So we don't want to do this. Prune apricots and cherries in the summer only. Summer pruning isn't bad. It can be done. I'm going to skip over a lot of this because summer pruning is also relatively straightforward. So what are the forms that we're going to talk about? We're going to briefly talk about open centers. This is the most common stuff. We've already looked at this. This is the most common method, great for stone fruits and almonds, good for most other fruits. You can prune apples and pears to this. You get the best sunlight penetration and the easiest harvesting. What you don't have is a really strong structure. These tend to be structurally fairly weak. You're going to select your scaffolding limbs in the first 2 growing seasons because they're really close to the ground, and then you'll just touch them up in the dormant season. But you keep your center open from the start. You really can't prune a tree effectively to an open center you can't change your mind in the middle of this and say, oh, I'm going to take my modified central leader and prune it to an open center without creating big wounds. And those big wounds will decay, and that's critical in an open center tree. So you really can't go back to an open center. It's either you plan it right from the beginning or you don't do it at all. The ideal open center structure looks a little bit like this. You have radial balance. I'll get to what that looks like in a minute. But you have vertical separation. So your branches do not all come off at the same point. They are spaced out a little bit. This can be reasonably strong if it's done right. Please turn off your mic. Thank you. The central leader for large trees, for larger trees, not apricots, apples and pears are mostly done this way. So you want to have establish a strong leader. The left is what we're looking for. The 2 images below here are not what we're looking for. These competing leaders are not ideal. They can be okay if it's occurs high enough in the tree, but that's generally, if we're looking for a strong central leader, that's not what we're looking for because so the tree on the right is a tree with a strong central leader. These are sycamores, not fruit trees. The tree on the left is a disaster. That, if we load it with fruit, will pull itself apart in short order and we'll get stuff that looks like this. And once this happens to your fruit tree, it's the beginning of the end. The tree will never adequately have enough structure to support heavy fruit loads, so you're done. So if that's the problem, we can go for a nice balance as a modified central leader. That tends to look like this. We start with a central leader and then we prune it to an open center at the top. This is great for walnuts and persimmons, but we also see it frequently used for apples, pears, figs, and other trees. You started as central leader. So choose the pruning style with the varietal that you want to get to the effect. I'm only going to mention perpendicular Vs. You will know this is what a perpendicular V looks like. It's usually used in very intensive, very heavy pruning and very densely planted things. This works great, but it also requires a lot of dedication to keep it going. So here it is in the very tiny tree in the upper left. In the lower right, you can see the same trees. You notice they have planted about twice as many as they originally wanted. It just ended up getting too choked. But this is basically just an open center tree in an extreme form. I'm just going to mention fruit bushes. If you thought perpendicular Vs were intensive, fruit bushes are even more. You have to really like pruning. These fruit bushes will require you to prune every summer, 3 or 4 times a year. Chuck Ingalls, who handed me this presentation once a long time ago, was a huge fan of this. He went out and pruned his trees about every month and a half during the summer. And if you miss one, it's a disaster. So, I mean, you really have to be dedicated if you choose this. I'm not going to say much more about it, other than there are some really big advantages and there are some big disadvantages. Now, if you want to take it even farther, the formal sort of French espalier is another option. This can work out great, but again, this takes a lot of work. But it looks fantastic, especially in these more formal gardens. I'm not a huge fan of formal gardens, but that doesn't mean you're not. And I really like it, seeing it when somebody else does it, but it's because I'm lazy. That's one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of it. But you can see people who do some amazing stuff with espaliers and things. These offer the advantages of fantastic light penetration, easy fruit harvesting, all this other stuff, but at the cost of lots and lots of pruning and fussing with things. So fruit thinning, before we get too much farther, we've got, no, we're going to make it just a little bit. Yeah, we're on time. We might not make it fruit citrus, but fruit thinning is important no matter what you choose. With fruit trees, they all produce way more fruit than you can really use. There's differences in the varietals, so you got to get to know your fruit trees in particular. But if left unthinned, they will produce a ton of fruit, which will weigh down their branches, and they'll all be really small. So that is this right-hand side of the thing. Now, if you thin the fruit out, you'll get bigger, you'll get fewer and fewer fruit, and the tree will put that effort into making bigger and higher quality fruit. And there's a peak in there someplace where you get a number of decently sized fruit. At the other extreme end, you'll get, if you prune all the way down to 4, you will get 4 great big apples at the end of the year, or at the end of the season. So fruit thinning increases fruit size, improves fruit color, reduces your diseases. You can read all this, right? It reduces limb breakage because you're carrying a lot less weight ultimately in the thing. There are a number of ways to get this done. Hand thinning is the most thorough, but time consuming. And basically you're selectively eliminating small damaged fruit and then moving on from there. There are less formal ways to do this. So hand thinning is great, but you can just use what's called a cluster buster. This is usually a section of hose that you just duct tape onto the end of an old broomstick or something, and you just smack things until there's only a few fruits left. This is best done when they're a little bit bigger than a quarter sized. Hand thinning, you really want to do more like dime to quarter size. This might be a little bit late, but it makes a much better picture. There are other tools you can use to do the cluster buster, including fan belts and all kinds of things, but you can make them all whatever wires. Thinning and spacing. You want to do this work now in 3/4 inch to 1 inch in late April to early May. Actually, we're a little early. You're right. Spacing depends on the tree vigor, depends on your fruit type. So you want to have 4 to 6 inches between some of your larger fruits, particularly peaches. Apricots, you can get away with being a little bit closer together, but you don't want them touching at maturity. That's basically where you're going. Apples are, again, they're the same idea. Thin to 1 fruit per cluster or about 6 inches. You do not want them touching as you grow because it makes them super susceptible to things like codling moth. Pears have varietal differences. Partlets don't have any thinning. We are within a minute or so. Flowering and fruiting problems. If you're getting few or no flowers, it very likely could be a lack of chilling. It could be the fact that they're overcropping. You're getting these alternate bearing years, severe pruning, or they're too young. Fruit drop is almost always normal. Often a lack of pollination. So some fruit drop is normal, especially in citrus. It can also be the result of lack of pollination, and sometimes it's a result of worms, diseases, drought, or fruit load. Small fruit can be overcropping. You may wonder, I have not introduced the term of overcropping yet. It's basically alternate bearing. Some trees will go into a cycle where they produce way too much fruit in one year. They exhaust themselves trying to produce all that fruit. And so they'll set very few buds the next summer because they're exhausted. So then the next year they will produce very few fruit, which means that they'll have build up all these energy reserves, which makes them the next year after that set a lot of fruit buds, and on you go, where you get these alternating years of heavy fruit, light fruit, heavy fruit, and you don't want that. So the way you're going to avoid this is you're going to thin your fruit in the heavy fruit years to make sure that the tree doesn't exhaust itself producing so much fruit, and that will even things out. Okay, so lack of flavors, usually of either a variety or over irrigation thing. Fruit split is uneven irrigation typically. Sometimes it's a variety. They can't handle the much as intense sun as you're getting or something like that. So very quickly, how do you figure out where your bud and your graft is? Most true varietals must be grafted because they don't breed true. This is true for apples. It's true for pears. You can't just stick a seed in the ground and get what you planted it out of. You have to graft to get the same varietal. That's why scions are so important. I know we're stopping here. I will finish these last two slides.
Actually,
we're done.
It's perfect. You have till 10:30. So finish up your last two slides and then we have time for questions. So this is great,
Sounds
Stephen.
good. Great. Disease resistance, again, we've already covered this. Rootstocks are developed for disease resistance and insect resistance. It turns out that some of these disease-resistant rootstocks, for historical reasons, it's an interesting story, we don't have time, also resulted in dwarfing trees. So that's how we came up with dwarfing rootstocks. And dwarfing trees have their own advantages. This is why we do this whole thing. You can add pollinizers by grafting them onto your trees. This works out okay. It's better than fruit salad trees. Fruit salad trees are when we have lots of different varietals. You'll get like your lemons and your limes and your oranges and your grapefruits all grafted onto one tree. And it sounds fantastic, but they don't always work out that well. And we can get into, and it has to do with the rootstock's going to be most closely related to one or two of those varieties. And so it's going to form a better graft union with one or two of those. So what you typically find is some of your branches outperform other branches. And now, if it wasn't complicated enough, you're trying to cut things back to balance the performance. And so, yeah, fruit salad trees sound good. They can be a pain in the butt to maintain. But if you've got limited space, fine. So there's a lot of different types and techniques of budding and grafting. We do not have time to go into that today, but you can go into join the California Rare Fruit Growers. They typically have a grafting workshop in February or March. I know we just passed that probably. And you can learn a lot about these things. But here's what budding grafting unions look like. Sometimes they can be kind of subtle, like you see English walnut on a paradox walnut rootstock. That's pretty subtle. This is a rootstock. This is what a graft union typically looks like. This is a sucker coming up from the base. Not all trees are happy with the grafts that get made for one reason or another. Sometimes the grafts are really obvious, like you see on English walnut on black walnut rootstock, or almonds, or it's not so obvious on this apricot. So we're going to stop there. We can have another talk on growing citrus trees later. We typically do once in the summer, that kind of things. And we will take questions from here, and let me know.
And also, Stephen, I would think we would post your presentation up on the CT site. So then those who are interested in looking at your slides for growing citrus trees, you usually have a lot of text points on it, so they can also explore that too.
Yep. We got, but there aren't that many slides for the citrus before we start getting into the diseases, which is sort of its own topic. And so, yeah.
Okay. So now I think we can open it up if people have questions. So you can either put it in the chat or you can come off of mute and ask Stephen. So we have about 9 minutes and then we'll take a break. Well, I have a dumb question. So suckers and water spouts. So basically, you're just going to cut them all back, right? Because you don't want to have the suckers sort of competing with the crown and with the main trunk. And then also you want to take off most of the water spouts too, right?
Yeah, that is the rule. And it is an absolute rule for the most part with suckers. The only reason you might want to keep a sucker would be as if you're trying to grow your own rootstock, and you could pull that sucker off and then dip it in rooting hormone, and you would get rootstock. That's how, people do this kind of thing to supply you with rootstocks. You could do your own rootstock that way. That's the only reason I can ever think that you would want to keep suckers around. Water sprouts are ideal for cutting off and making using as scions for other tissue. They're very vigorous. They go really quickly. And there are those rare occasions where you may have a branch that's dying that you've just pruned for fire blight or something like that. You get a water sprout off of that same basic branch that you could retrain into a whole new branch. So there are times when you would want to do that, but generally that means you're going to want to tie it back or otherwise move it out so it's not so upright, because the water sprouts tend to go straight up. But that's rare. I almost never see anybody using water sprouts that way.
Thanks. Okay. We have two in the chat, and then I also see Layla has her hand raised up. So the first in the chat, and Melissa, I'm kind of taking over your role here. I hope that's okay. So Elena was saying, what's your opinion of columnar apple trees? Columnar apple trees.
My opinion is they are horses for courses. They are really great if you don't mind climbing. One, I've seen columnar apple trees. Those are some of the taller trees I've seen. I don't know what variety they were. Nobody knows what variety they were. They were planted around the turn of the century by somebody's grandfather. But they have a predisposition to forming included bark. So the way they dealt with this on the apple trees I was seeing was they grafted their own it's a long story. Yeah, I don't have a problem with it. Everything has its pluses and its minuses. The minuses there are that you may need to you're going to need to worry about structure with columnar apple trees, but it's not an insurmountable problem.
Okay, thank you. Next one is from Gail. If you plan to prune for small fruit trees, what are your thoughts on planting multiple fruit trees in one hole?
What?
Yeah, I don't recommend that at all. I would much prefer to plant multiple fruit trees in different holes and then prune them appropriately, like you saw in that modified central V. Yeah.
Okay. And then Layla, I think I'm mispronouncing your name, but if you want to come off of mute and ask.
Yeah, that's okay. So my question is probably also kind of basic, but going back to what you were saying about cherries and the pollinizer, is it correct that some fruit trees will not pollinate each other? Like if you had two Rainier cherries, you have to actually have two different kinds to pollinate?
Absolutely. That's what that slide was about. There's a lot of self-incompatibility. So if a tree recognizes the pollen that it's getting as itself, it will not accept that pollen, and it will not work. So you have to have another, and some trees will not produce fruit without, actually quite a few trees will not produce fruit without being pollinized. So if you want fruit, you're going to have to find something else.
Okay, good.
Oh, and I should mention, I don't know if I mentioned this. So ornamental cherries should be almost a universal pollinizer, because none of the the cherries out there are closely enough related to ornamental cherries that they will recognize it as self. So that should be a universal pollinizer for some of those cherry varietals. Same thing goes for a bunch of other things. Crab apples are a universal pollinizer for apples. So if you want to just put one crab apple in your yard, it'll pretty much work for every varietal of apple you've got. Enough said.
Okay. And in the chat, Alaire's asking, my landscaper annihilated my fruit trees this winter, figs, apple, and pear. Is there any hope for them?
Yeah, there should be, depending upon how vigorous and young they are. Some trees like figs tend to decay, and some, depending upon how big the cuts were made too. If they're small cuts, smaller than your wrist, you've got hope. on the figs, hopefully they're smaller than your thumb because they tend to not close very quickly. I would focus very heavily on pruning off all of the fruit this year. You're going to initiate alternate bearing by doing that, but you're also going to force the tree to put all of its energy into closing those wounds and rebuilding structure and those kinds of things. So no, if this was my call, and I haven't seen your trees, I would focus on fertilizing, encouraging leaf growth, wiping out all fruit production for the next year. Your gardener probably did that for you anyway. And rebuilding structure. And then over the next couple of years, you're going to have to work on, this is going to initiate alternate bearing. So then you're going to have to, in the heavy fruit years, you're going to have to thin really aggressively the fruit to keep the tree in some kind of balance. And I'm sorry that happened.
Thank you. And then Robin, if you want to go ahead and come off of mute.
Thank you. I had a question to kind of follow up with Lily's question about the cherries, but more towards avocados. I just want to know if it's a similar process that avocados need like the opposite pollinizers, or is it just a different type of flower? Because I've heard you have to have like type A or type B with avocado.
Well, so I'm not so good with avocados. My understanding is that some avocados do require type A and type B kind of things. And that makes it pretty simple, simply because there are only about 2 major lines that they will not recognize, that you have self-incompatibility with. I think there are some self-compatible avocados out there though. So that makes the situation a little more complicated, and you're really going to have to talk to your nurseryman to figure out what they are. Although you can look this up. If you know your varietal, you can figure out what type it is, and then you can go look and figure out what type the alternate is. You also need to pay attention to whether they're Mexican or Guatemalan avocado races. The Mexicans are frost hardy, at least within reason. The Guatemalans are not frost hardy at all. And you're really not going to get away with planting like Haas here, even though they sell them. It's irresponsible by some measures. They'll sell you Haas for $45 and it'll die in the first frost that you experience. Now, if you live in Tiburon or Belvedere and you're right next to the water, you can probably grow Haas because it just doesn't, the number of days where you get freezing temperatures are just so rare, you can get away with it. But almost anywhere else, Nevada, you're not growing Haas. Maybe 20 years from now you will, but yeah.
But it's within the same cultivar though, right? So it's not like you're picking a, sorry, that's not what I meant. Like with cherries, you're picking a Bing and then a whatever else kind. With the avocados, it's just like a type A Haas, type B Haas. Is that correct?
I didn't think so. But
Oh.
again, like I'm not,
Got it.
I believe every cultivar is either a class type A or a type B. And there is no variation within that cultivar. You don't have type A Haas and type B Haas. What you have is you'll have type A Haas and type B
bacon or whatever.
bacon. Right, exactly.
Okay.
And if you get type A Haas and you get that other one that's also type A, it's not doing you any good. So you really need to be careful about your avocado type selection, and you need to be careful that they're all Mexicali varietals if you're growing them in most places in Marin and Sonoma, because the Haas's won't live beyond 1 year. And it's not going to do you any good.
Okay, thank you.
Great. And we have time for just barely for one last question. So Linda asked, do Bartlett pear trees need a pollinizer? Is an ornamental pear an acceptable pollinizer?
I don't know that off the top of my head. I would have to go look that up. And so I'm sorry to say, I can't answer your question. I believe they don't need a pollinizer. I have a Bartlett in my backyard that produces every year, but it is possible that one of my neighbors has a pear in their backyard that the bees are traveling back and forth to, because bees can fly up to 2 miles, and I just don't know everything that's out there. But I get a pretty good crop of Bartletts every year, and I don't do squat. And I have an Asian pear. That may be all it takes. I'm sorry, I was not thinking Asian pear, but it's probably closely enough related that it can pollinize. So that's probably why. So I don't know. That is the very short answer.
Excellent. All right, folks. Well, we're going to go ahead and say goodbye to Stephen, and then we're at 10:31-ish. So we'll come back at 10:45. So thank you, Stephen. That was great. And you cranked it
Thank
out.
you. Yay. It
Thank you
was
very much.
a wonderful time talking to all of you guys. I really hope I get to talk to this class more in person in the future. Please come by my office and say hello, because it's hard to get to know everybody, and you guys are always so fun. So I look forward to meeting any of you. If you got any questions, don't hesitate to say hi.
Thank you so much.
Oh, I got to stop sharing.
And then I'm going to share my screen, Melissa.
Okie dokie.
And then I'm going to do that.
Okay.
Okay.
Okie dokie. As I mentioned earlier, our next presenter, Joe Jennings, was unfortunately unable to be here with us live, but agreed to pre-record his presentation. Joe will talk about the joys of growing vegetables and tomatoes with a specific focus on our climate here in Marin. With, excuse me, with Master Gardener's Tomato Market coming up April 20th and pre-sale pickup of plants on the 17th, this is a good time to think about vegetables and tomatoes. Joe graduated from the Marin Master Gardeners class of 2012. He was a Farm Day co-lead in 2013 and held key positions in the tomato market 12 through 15, including being the lead for the Bon Air market in 2014 and 15. He has also conducted numerous public seminars on behalf of MMG, such as year-round vegetable gardening and tomato gardening. And if that was not enough, he was VP of Outreach 2014 and 15. He is a native of Washington State and, in fact, moved back to Seattle with his wife in 2019. Despite the move to Washington, he has come back each year via Zoom to make this presentation to the new member trainees. Joe is very disappointed he couldn't be here today, but has said he is available via email for any questions trainees may have. Joe's presentation is divided into two parts, vegetables and tomatoes. Since we had a break, I don't think another break is necessary, but please let me know if you would like a short break between videos. The videos are about 85 minutes in total, although they may be a little shorter. These videos are posted on the training YouTube page. The link is available in CT.
Okay, now I'm going to launch it. And let's see.
Good morning. This is Joe Jennings. I'm here
Can you all hear?
to teach the vegetable
hear,
herb
but
gardening
don't see.
class for the trainees for
Okay.
2024. Sorry, I'm not with you all
Sorry, let
today.
me pause that. So you don't see it, huh? Okay.
I'm seeing vegetable and herb gardening and the YouTube.
And you're not
think I'm
seeing
on
the
an airplane
YouTube?
to Italy at this time. So I
I'm just
apologize
seeing
for this
our
inconvenience.
slide, not Joe Jennings.
Okay. Sorry, folks. Let me see if I can do this. As you can see, I don't do this very often. So let me find. So can
Hopefully
you see
this
it
will
now?
be a useful class.
Nope.
We'll have
No?
an hour and then there'll be a break and then
Sorry, folks. Let me get all right, let me go back to
Good morning. This is
Any
Joe
better?
Jennings. I'm here
Nope.
to the vegetable herb garden.
We did it yesterday and it worked. Okay.
No.
Reaching out to anybody who might be able to walk me through it on the class. I'm sorry I'm lame. So any clues on that, how we can then mini player, full screen?
Or, sorry, I'm not with you all today.
Are you sharing the screen?
I am sharing the screen.
Because we're just saying you.
Right. Okay, let me, oh boy. Okay, let me go back to escape. I'm sorry, folks. Setting default view. So you're not, and are you seeing it now?
So I apologize for this inconvenience.
Okay. Let's see.
This is Alisanne.
Yeah.
If you give me the link, I can screen share it for you.
Oh, you're wonderful. Okay. So let's see if I can then get to, and we'll start with that one. I'll put it in the chat. Let's see. And to everyone. Nope, that's not it. Sorry, Alisanne.
That's small. Hang on.
Should have come across twice. So hopefully you could click on the link on the first one.
There you go. Thanks.
You all are very patient. Sorry. I worked this out with, we tried it earlier this morning and then obviously.
It'll just take me a second.
Thank you.
Trainees 2024. Sorry, I'm not with you all today. I think I'm on an airplane.
Hear him.
So I apologize for this inconvenience.
We don't see. Oh, wait. Alisanne start screen sharing. Good.
I'm going to rewind it
Okay.
and put it on full screen.
You're great. Thank you. You know what? It takes a huge village, right? So thank you.
Jennings, I'm a master gardener. I started in master gardener.
You don't see it yet. Oh, good.
Seattle 20, and I'm now a master gardener here in King County. I taught vegetable and native plant gardens.
Can we go from here?
I've grown them in Marksburg.
Yeah, it's small, but I think everybody can see it, right? Yes, perfect.
Perfect.
Fire resistant landscape here in Washington State, spring and summer and winter vegetables.
Is the volume okay?
Yep.
Fine for me.
Today, the goal is to give you a background in vegetable gardening and basic principles and how to think about planting and planting, how to care for them, and then where herbs fit in, and then harvesting, and basic problem diagnosis resources for you. The context for this is we want our gardening to be sustainable, which means preserve natural resources, recycle waste, use appropriate cultural practices, protect the diversity of life around us, which is why integrated pest management is so important to vegetable gardening. And so this is one of the core principles underlying this presentation. And the other is like Intuit, which is you're trying to learn vegetable gardening in the context of climate change, which is that there's significant changes occurring in average conditions over the past years, decades, centuries. And we have plenty of evidence of this now. But what it tends to do is give us more erratic and extreme weather. So this context, again, against sustainable gardening means you have to keep being a student to learn what's presently going on and what you need to do to address it and adjust for it. It isn't one of those learn how to grow a carrot, grow the carrot forever. Those days are over. So with that being said, what is a vegetable? It's a herbaceous plant grown for some edible part that you eat. And herbs are seed-producing annuals and biennials and perennials, which has medicinal, savory, or aromatic qualities. This is, for most of the world, this is the largest part of their food supply, is vegetables and herbs. So we're really focused in on one of the oldest behaviors in humanity and one of the most important. So to begin with, how do you think about planting a new garden? Many people don't pull all the way back. Even if they have a garden, they don't pull all the way back and say, is my vegetable garden in the very best place on this property? So if you're looking for an ideal place for a vegetable garden, you need at least 6 hours, preferably 8 or more of sun in June. Preferably some gentle southern slope for sunlight and air circulation, a windbreak to protect it against strong winds. It's essential for good water drainage, and you need easy access to water, compost, and debris removal. And just remember, the closer it is to your kitchen, the more likely you'll go out and use it. The further away your vegetable garden is from the kitchen, the more infrequent the visit. The other thing you have to think about is how to protect it from pests. And most importantly, if you're just starting out in the vegetable world, build it to the scale and size and height and access that works for you. You don't have to build the maximum vegetable garden on your first outing. In fact, the interesting thing about vegetable gardens is you can incrementally add to them over time as you get more comfortable with it. Because bigger is not better. What is better is closer to the kitchen and better ergonomics. So when you think of the weather in Marin County, you should be thinking of the weathers in Marin County because there's such a high degree of variability as you go from the coastal climate to the north coast to the marine effect areas. And so on the very same day, Mill Valley can be socked in, San Rafael can be warm, and Novato can be cooking. So you have to be clear on where in Marin you live. And quite honestly, when you look at the weather, planning wise, averages are interesting, but increasingly what you're worried about are highs and lows. So for example, you would think in May, you shouldn't ever have to worry about frost. Historically, there have been frosts in May. You would think that you will have rainfall consistently all winter because of the averages. There have been many years where there's been a month of no rainfall in the middle of the winter. So when you look at your garden, you can't think of it once and then kind of put it away in your head. You have to pay attention to how much rain is it getting? What are the temperatures that are forecast? Is there high wind? Because the garden is a living thing and the weather is a moving target nowadays. Now, checking this morning, this is March 20th, 2024, you've had a blessing of rain. So the rainfall at Lake Waukenitas, which is where the Marin Water District measures, is at 122% of average, which is great. And the reservoirs are at 110% of average. This is not normal because by definition, it's above average. I pay attention to the reservoirs and the rainfall. The rainfall I pay attention to every day. The reservoirs probably once every couple of weeks in Marin, because what you want to make sure of is that you're keeping your head current to, well, are we going into a drought? Are we likely to have water restrictions? What's going on? Now, in planting a garden, again, if you sit on the Master Gardener help desk for any length of time, and people call up and say, my vegetable garden I just put it in, it's not doing well. The first question you should ask them is, how many hours of sunlight does it get? And if they planted it under trees, they've got a problem because vegetables require a lot of sun. So the way to think of it is to go into a property and use your compass on your iPhone or your cellular phone and establish what is south, east, and west. And because none of us know accurately, whatever skill we had as primates earlier, we don't have anymore. So establish where south is, east, and west. And you want to align the garden beds and literally the rows of plants to the longest direction of the sun, where it will get the most sun. And the other thing you have to think about is, where will the shadows fall? So many of us have gardens that have plenty of sun at some point in the day, but because of trees or buildings, they get shaded. So you have to sort of watch your garden. And I'm just taking a practice of, when you're planting a garden, go out every hour or a day and just take a picture of where is the sun and where are the shade. And when you look at this, it doesn't mean the shaded areas can't be garden. It means that only certain things will grow there well. So it's just alignment of the garden to sun is sort of jacks or better. Then you have three ways of having a garden: in ground, raised beds, containers. These three approaches have different pluses and minuses. So this is sort of a macro view. In ground has the most flexibility in terms of varieties that do well. And if you plant hybrids, you can address viruses in the soil. If you have gopher cages or wire, you can address critters underground like gophers. And you actually use the least irrigation and fertilizer because the plants are drawing from the ground. If you go to raised beds, again, all varieties will grow there because you basically kind of emulated soil, but you're up 2 feet. You can address viruses in the underlying soil by creating a barrier and putting in just potting soil above, but over time that may not work. If you put gopher wire across the bottom of your beds, you can defeat the gophers. And you will use more water and fertilizer than you do in ground. And that's because those raised beds are not drawing food or water from the soil around them. They're in essence separated. In containers, this is where you have to pay a lot of attention. First off, there are varieties that will do better in containers than others. You can get viruses in containers, particularly if you use regular soil from the yard in your container. So you want to be very careful about that. You are not likely to have gophers. You might have other critters, but you won't have gophers. But the irrigation and fertilizer actually has to be more thoughtful because what you don't want is water running out the bottom of the pot. So you can't run your containers for as long as you would run your raised beds or in ground. So you want more frequent irrigation in smaller periods of time. So these are the three, call them venues for vegetable gardening in your garden. The advantage is, for example, with containers, you can put containers in the sunniest spots on your deck and patio. You can also use containers above ground throughout the yard if you have areas with virus problems. So containers are the most flexible of the three in terms of placement and movement. Raised beds can be the most ergonomic because you're not leaning over as much as you are within ground. So there's some trade-offs here. When you think about access, what a 20-year-old, a 40-year-old, a 60-year-old, or an 80-year-old should do in the garden is different. So I think of it this way, and I'm somewhere in that last group heading towards, I'm in the middle, 60 to 80. How many sides of access do I have to my garden? Can I get all the way around it, all sides? Is it only on one side? Sometimes when you plant against the fence, you can only get access on one side. Is it only two sides? Second question, how far can you reach? Now, the further you have to reach, the more likely you will fall over. It's unfortunate, but true. So 18 to 24 inches about the max for a one-side access only garden. So narrower bed. You can have a one-side access only garden, make it narrower. If you have access on all four sides, then you can have a wider garden, 36 to 48 inches bed, because you can walk around it and everywhere you're within 12 and 24 inches of reaching the middle. I hope that made sense because it's really basic and you'll see people mess that up. Really wide raised beds that they have to climb into to get to the middle means you're compressing the soil by walking on it. It's not great. So how high should a raised bed be? I used to say 12 to 24 and my friends and I are getting older. And so 36 is looking good. So it's a question of your mobility and how much you want to bend over. Now, access. Water has to get to the garden. Further you are from a hose bib or an irrigation line, the more difficult it will be. So identify before you do anything, what's my water source for this garden? 2, the closer you are to compost, whether it's compost you're generating or compost you're bringing in on a wheelbarrow, the better, because you're using compost at least 2 or 3 times a year. People forget this, but how hard is it to haul away the debris that can't be composted? Gardens that are at the bottom of hillsides or on stairways, how are you going to get stuff out? Are you going to carry it in buckets? Can you use a wheelbarrow? You need optimally a safe path to get in and out with materials and debris. If you're building your own with lumber, try to use standard lumber sizes so you're not paying extra for cuts or doing cuts yourself. And I know this sounds somewhat stupid, but measure the width of your wheelbarrow so that your beds are far enough apart that you can get a wheelbarrow through. I personally have only designed 2 gardens that made that mistake. Nice garden, couldn't get a wheelbarrow through. And it's embarrassing and you feel stupid. Now, raised beds or in ground or in containers all have trellising and scaffolding issues. And this is because there are plants that inherently grow better if they are able to grow vertically. When you have a vertical garden, you also have a wind sail. So you can, it's amazing how often there's a windstorm at the height of tomato season and the scaffolding blows over. So whichever scaffolding strategy you pick, and there are many, it has to be secured to something. And it has to be secured down into the ground and preferably laterally. And all of these scaffolding approaches support different varieties of vegetables. So the other part of this puzzle is I have scaffolding that I take down in the fall and then I put up when I decide what plants are going where in the spring. So I don't have one scaffolding system. I have a mobile scaffolding system that moves around with the plants. That being said, you can do an awful lot with sticks and string on your own. You can do a lot with construction materials like this deer fencing. You can buy fancy atrium-like scaffolds and very fancy things, or you can be very simple. But you need to look at your garden, look at what you're planning to plant, and identify the scaffolding needs. And the scaffolding needs to go in when the seeds go in, or the starts. Because if you wait, you can damage plants putting in scaffolding. You can damage the roots. You can put the scaffolding through the irrigation line. I've done that. So you want to time your garden so that you have your planting plan and you have the scaffolding right next to those garden beds, so that when the seeds of the starts go in, the scaffolding goes in. And frankly, the irrigation lines are run at the same time. So in my worldview, the raised beds or the in-ground or the containers, you establish that first. You then do your planting plan, what's going where, and then you lay out your irrigation lines as appropriate to what you're planting and your scaffolding, and plant and put in the seeds in one throw. Then you know how you're going to water, how it's going to be supported, and you know what you planted and where. So far, so good? Okay. Now about containers, bigger is better, just in a nutshell. 5 gallon is, my opinion, the minimum size that you should standardize on so that everything in the garden will grow well. Plastic is better because it retains moisture. You do not want dishes, but you do want it to have holes for drainage. And the reason is you need the drainage because things like tomatoes don't want to be in damp soil. On the other hand, if you have dishes there, they're sitting in the water and it promotes mosquitoes. So container, 5 gallon or greater, with holes, but no dishes. Now, the problem in a container is you're planting plants and putting in compost and soil and fertilizer and mulch. And then for a whole summer, you're pouring water through it. So you should assume at the end of every summer, the soil is depleted. And personally, what I've taken to doing is dumping the soil out on plastic, and you find roots and stones and stuff, missing gloves, and get the soil, revitalize it with more soil or replace it, and then rebuild your pots for the winter crop. So I actually strongly advise at least once or twice a year a complete rebuild of the soil in your containers. The second thing to think about, you may want to pass the balance between relying on compost only or compost and fertilizer. Slow release organic vegetable fertilizer is a pretty good idea in some climates. So take a look at it. And again, as we discussed earlier, your containers will need more water more frequently than the raised beds. So smaller run times, more frequent runs of the irrigation line. Yes. I'm almost certain I can say this with absolute certainty. All gardens are buffet lines for deer, raccoons, squirrels, birds, moles, voles, and raccoons. Just summarizing, not to mention household cats and dogs. So if you're going to plant a garden, you pretty much have to figure out, how am I going to keep these critters out, or else you really won't have a garden. The deer or the raccoons can mow through a garden in a night. So you need to have a fencing strategy, some cases a netting strategy, and certainly if you're doing raised beds, you need to go for wire strategy, because once you've established those things, you're not going to be bothered by a lot of critters. If you don't establish those things, you're not going to be bothered by a harvest, because the critters will get them. The other thing to be aware of is, for example, we go through waves of critter problems. A couple of years ago, the community garden in Mill Valley had an infestation of field rats. Other people have had severe problems with raccoons and deer. And it seems like you get a flood of this going through. So if you're planting your garden, it's not aesthetically pleasing, but it's essential to have a strategy to deal with pests like this. Another thing to pay attention to, see your hands. This is not the right way to do this, but some of you live on hillsides, some of you live on the bottom of hills, and some of you live on the flats. Now, cold air goes downhill. So in the fall, winter, the coldest places will be at the bottom of hillsides and on the flats. And the hill itself will be warmer than the bottoms. In the summer, it's the reverse. It can be the ground, the base, the level areas can be warmer. And when you watch wind, most of Marin has wind issues. So sit and watch your garden carefully, because this is where fences and buildings can protect gardens. You can tuck a garden in west or south facing along a fence or the side of a house, and that can give the plants a buffer from the wind. Another issue is if you're, like, for example, in Nevada, you can have very, very dry, high winds, literally wick all the moisture out of the garden in a couple of hours. So think about where you're planting. And this is where trellis plants like peas and beans can serve as a wind screen for the rest of the garden. So if you have a windy side of the garden that won't cause sun blockage when you put up a trellis, put your trellis plants along there so that as they grow in, they'll give some wind screening for the rest of the garden. We're having more severe rainstorms. So if you're planting a garden in low ground, and you can tell, because wait till winter, and if there's standing water where you're planting, that can be a problem. So you have no choice. You need to build better drainage. But if you can avoid places where water pools, that would be great, because we have these storms where you guys get a lot of water in a relatively short amount of time. And if the ground doesn't perk, the water sits there for a couple days, it's not good for an in-ground garden. So I'm not good at this one. Gardening plans, I understand them conceptually. You do a drawing, and then you kind of list out what you plant where, and then you kind of rationalize it, and then you plant, and then it's wonderful. The simple form of this is tall versus short, long growing season versus short, and crop rotation. And I can get my head around that. So if you look in your handbook, you can study up about garden plans and get all into the design of it. We'll deal with crop rotation shortly, and that's how I think about it. So that was all that was all the planning side. So now then, how do you think about vegetables? Well, they're annuals and perennials, literally, which means things with a less than a year life, things with more than 1 year, possibly 2 or 3, or in the case of asparagus, 15-year life. And then a second way to think about vegetables is cool season versus warm season. So, and cool season is a slight misnomer, and I'll get into it in a minute. So cool season is, for Marin, call it October 1st to April 15th. That's where temperatures are 55 to 75. These are plants that can tolerate slight frost. So your cool weather plants are like lettuces, kale, Swiss chard, things like that. In the warm season, these are plants that need 65 to 95 degree temperature, and they do not like frost. So you've got these two things going on. And objectively, before I go on, I never got to 4 seasons of crops in Marin, but I could do 3. And so when you're doing 3, you're planting, always thinking about, okay, I'm putting this in now, I'm going to harvest here, and then I'm going to plant the next thing, and then I'm going to harvest there. So you have this sequencing and crop rotation. And what you want to make sure is that your warm season plants are ready to go in the ground starting somewhere around late April, May. And you'll be out of the garden with that crop by October. And then you have your winter season crop. So the major families are listed here. When I speak about crop rotation, what you're trying to avoid, and the classic is in the Solanaceae, if you're rotating peppers, tomatoes, and eggplant, it's not doing you any good because they're all in the same plant family, so they all have the same diseases and pests. So what you're really trying to do is rotate Solanaceae with Liliaceae or the Fabaceae, so that you're in different plant families in that location in order. So if you want to think about year-round vegetable gardening, and this is from Pam Pierce's excellent book, Golden Gate Gardening, you should be looking at planting in this is plants that you can put in February, March, April, May, July, August, October, November. And what this gives you is maximum use of your vegetable garden, but you have to be paying attention. And here we get to crop rotation. The basic rule of crop rotation is never plant the same plant or the same plant family in the same place 2 years in a row. The reason is the pests winter over in the soil. And so if you're repeating the same plant family over and over again, new insects, they're right there with their favorite food. And any soil-borne diseases, you're reinforcing them by planting the same plants. It also means that you're drawing the same nutrients from the soil for that family year after year. So the way to think about it, even if you just had 3 containers, is unless you're doing a complete change of soil every year, you want to have a tomato in one, you want to have a onion in another, and you want to have kale in a third, and then you just swap them. Growing from seeds. Personally, I love growing from seeds. But there are 2 ways to think about it. Direct sowing, which is you're going right into where they'll be through harvest. And You do this if something has a very short germination time or a very delicate root system. And so you have to prepare the soil and have the bird protection up and watch out for frost or drought so you don't put the seeds in and then have a frost. Or you can start the seeds on your windowsill in the house and get starts going and then bring them out later when they have more robust root systems. And then you're just timing when to move from the house to the garden. The easiest rule is if you see roots coming out of the bottom of your little pots, time to move. The reason to use seeds is you can buy exactly what you want and you have the least likelihood you're bringing disease with you. Things that are bought from plant stores, nurseries, you may or may not get exactly the variety you want, and you can be introducing things in the garden you don't want. We are confronted with, we get way smarter about pollination, mainly because we're having a crisis in pollinators. So when you think of a vegetable garden, part of the infrastructure you should be thinking about is which of these are self-pollinating, which need pollinators to come and help, and what attracts pollinators. And so, for example, the things that are self-pollinated, beans, peas, and tomatoes. Insect-pollinated, squash, pumpkins, melons, most cucumbers. The transfer, what's going on is, and you've studied pollination, I don't need to go into it more, but I plant around the vegetable garden bee attractors, coneflowers, sunflowers, California asters, seaside daisies. You can either put them in pots or you can put them in the raised bed or put them in the ground. But at the end of any row of any length, I want something that draws pollinators. Likewise, you can put lavender or rosemary around the outside of a garden. It's very pretty and it also draws a lot of pollinators. So talking about soil, I know you've had a soil class. I won't beat this to death. But one way to think about vegetable gardening is you're growing soil and the soil's growing the plants. So you have to be always thinking about what do I have? What am I short on? And how can I improve it? The old days of spading and rototilling or plowing are over. There's a lot of science that that's not a good idea. It destroys soil structure. So what you need to be thinking about is how do I keep weeds out? How do I keep building the soil like a layer cake? And how do I minimize disruption when I'm doing it? Now, if you're going to have a dormant garden over the winter, you can use green compost like fava beans to grow your soil, anything that fixes nitrogen. Or you can put down a significant amount of compost in the fall that can then break down into the soil and then be ready in the spring for your next planting. That's one approach. The other approach is if you're using the garden ongoingly through the year, then you want to pay attention to continuing to build the soil with compost year-round. So this is where you might have rows, and you have between the rows, you put compost in July, October, March, and May, or whenever you're getting ready to plant again. But look at how to work more compost into your beds as you go along. The other thing to pay attention to is root depth. There are relatively shallow rooted things, 1 to 2 feet, moderately rooted 1 to 4 feet, or very deeply rooted 1 to 6. When we get to the tomato class, I will show you some images of tomato root systems that are even a bit more than 6 feet deep and broad. The reason we bring this up is if you have containers or raised beds, your depth of the roots are going to be constrained by the depth of the container. So you don't want to plant tomato plant in a 6-inch deep pot. It won't work. It would have to be really broad. So what I recommend to people is go look at all of your containers and raised beds, measure their depth, and then organize what can go where. And then think through crop rotation relative to depth. Does that make sense? All right. Increasingly, fertilizer, organic fertilizer, 555 for vegetables, is a really good idea because we're pouring so much water in the winter through the soil. The soil is bleached out by the time you start growing again. So slow release fertilizers are a good idea. Compost is a good idea. Getting your soil tested is a good idea. So if you have the time, you can do soil testing before your spring planting, amend your soil to take into account what you're missing. Irrigation. Let's be honest, vegetable crops are not drought tolerant, almost by definition. They have a narrow window to get grown and produced, and they consume more water than you might like. And so, but the other side of it is they don't want to be overwatered. So, and your water needs when you're seeding or transplanting change as the plant gets bigger. So irrigation systems like drip irrigation or with emitters are the most efficient way to deliver water exactly where you want. And with a timer, exactly every other day or every day, whenever you need it. But there are people who prefer to hand water. And if you are someone hand watering, what are you watering? You're actually watering the soil, not the plant. So the old days of just standing over a garden, spraying water on the plants so that the leaves don't have dust on them, bad idea. If you're going to hand water, get underneath the leaf structure next to the plant and around the drip line and water the soil. The plant brings the water in through the soil, not the leaves or the fruit. I can't tell you how many weeds I pulled last year. I had a bad year. I got compost that had seeds in it. So early, often weeding, constant. You should be, because weeds compete for nutrients, water, and sunlight. They will grow faster than your vegetables. They'll choke them out. So it's important, pretty much whenever you walk through the garden, be prepared to pull weeds. And if you do that, and in addition, use mulch, you can control them. You're never going to be weed free. That concept, it's not possible. It just isn't. So suppressing weeds is important to the yield and not creating problems for yourself going down the road. The best way to figure out when to harvest is, and I have friends with spreadsheets, and they have, when did I plant and how many days to maturity? And so on this day, 65, 75, 85 days later, or 50 days later, I'll be harvesting. Doesn't exactly work that way. So what I recommend is checking your plants daily. And as you get closer, there's a cardinal rule of vegetable gardening, which is if a critter is going to get into your garden and eat your vegetables, it will be the night before you are going to harvest that one, because they're watching just like you are. So pay attention, watch, and not all of your vegetables of a certain type will be ripe at the same time. Things happen. So pay attention, harvest in the early morning. For flavor, consume fresh vegetables as soon after harvest as possible and avoid refrigeration. You don't want to pull everything out of the ground at once and then stick everything in the fridge because the flavor goes down. It's better to pull it out of the ground and walk in and eat it in the kitchen than to have a large harvest. If you have to store it, then you want to store it in conditions as close to the garden fresh possible. So personally, a cool storage is better than a refrigerator, like in the basement for potatoes and things. But look at each variety that you're growing. Look up what Wazoo recommends for storage, harvest and storage. And what I try to do is stagger my planting so I can harvest over time. Because you don't want to hope, for example, one year I planted, I think it was 50 leek plants at the same time. So they all got ripe at one time. And it's really hard in Marin to give away 50 leek plants. It was a lot of leeks. So let's talk about herbs. Herbs are plants that you grow for the flavor. You added two things, and they're annual, biennial, and perennial herbs. For example, basil is an annual. Sage is a biennial. Rosemary can be a perennial. When you look at your herb garden, personally, now you really want to be next to the kitchen. The closer you can place it to the kitchen, the better. And they have a range of partial shade to full sun and low to high water needs. So even though you might be mixing everything in one box, you're going to optimize either for full sun, and you have to be aware that the water needs are different. So I tend to keep my herbs very segregated from each other so that I can optimize for sunlight and water. The other horrendous thing is one man's herb is another man's invasive species. So things like mint, catnip, you've got to plant them in containers because if you put them in the ground, they will take off on you. And and herbs are impossible once they take off on you to get out. You'll be digging out mint for years. So what causes problems in the vegetable garden? Abiotic causes can be either too much water or not enough drainage, not too much or not enough light. They can be physically or chemically injured. They may not adapt to a growing site. You might have temperatures that are too high or too low, and you might be missing nutrients. The biotic causes are insects and plant disease. The virtue of the IPM site at UC Davis is the university has been tracking these problems by every variety of vegetable in the garden that grows well in California for decades. So if you're trying to figure out what is bothering your plant, you go to IPM, click on Home and Garden, or you can go to the Master Gardener site. And what you're trying to understand is, what am I looking at and what caused it? And sometimes it's more than one thing. But honestly, a very high percentage of the problems we encounter are improper plant selection or poor cultural practices. And so the wrong plant, wrong place, too much or not enough water, too much or not enough fertilizing, these are very common problems. Mishandling herbicides, very common problems. So if you go to IPM at UC Davis or the Master Garden Problem section. This will let you look at the plant, look at the problem you have in the garden, look at the picture. And the nice thing about vegetable gardening is you know what you planted. So you know corn. Okay, so now you're looking at corn. You're not trying to do plant ID, but you may have more than one problem at the same time. And so you can either go to the problem section in Master Gardeners, IPM, and as a master gardener, about half the time people ask me plant problems, I end up taking them to IPM on their phone or on an iPad in their house and saying, here's how you should learn to research the problems in your garden. And that becomes your core teaching platform. And also, you don't have to memorize all this stuff. You say, well, all right, you've got basil, you're seeing this problem. Let's go look on landscape on vegetables in the home and garden section. Let's look at basil. Let's look at the problems that commonly affect basil. Here's a picture that matches what you have. Boom. Now we've got from Davis the non-chemical and chemical solutions to what this problem is. So I hope this has been useful. We're going to take a short break and then come back and talk about tomatoes.
Cool. And Allison, I sent you the link for the next one, which is on tomatoes. So if you don't mind doing your same tips and tricks, that would be great.
When dirt and stink lingers deep, clean deep with new Arm & Hammer teeth.
Metagenics gets to the root of whole body health with
Yeah.
pure ingredients sourced
Sorry.
from nature.
There we go.
Trusted
Yeah.
and trusted by
Hi.
That it?
So good. We didn't even taste them yet.
Is that the end? Sorry, I had walked away.
So it looks like, so I sent you the link for the next one. That was in
Oh,
the
I'm sorry. I was wondering, is it possible for you to screen share the next one?
possible, but it didn't work the last time, so I'll try.
It takes up my computer so much.
Oh, okay. All right, let's
can't-
try. I don't know if it's gonna work, but
I
okay.
don't mind doing it, but then I can't use my computer at all.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Let's try, but I may have to come back to you. Okay, so
Okay.
I'm gonna stop your sharing, and then I'm gonna try to come back to this. I'm gonna go down.
So you click on the screen share button, and then it gives you a choice of screens that you want to share.
Yep.
And
So-
you click on that.
I'm gonna click on the link to run it.
Good morning. This is the
Can you
second
see it?
class. We'll now be talking about tomato gardening.
I
Can
can
you
see it,
see
but
it?
it's running. Yeah, I'll go ahead and share.
I'm sorry. Let's see. I can try stop sharing and see if I can find it in my other screens, like you were saying, but
That's okay.
it's not.
On the screen
Can
here.
you see it?
Good morning. This is the second class. Will now be, just to remind you, this is being recorded. But actually,
Are you all
it's a
seeing
recording
it?
You'll be hearing. So not to worry.
No. Why don't I go ahead and share again?
You're wonderful. Okay, thank you.
So tomato gardening in Marin County.
So I'll stop this.
Okay, and I'll start.
Yep.
Talking about tomato gardening. And I'll just put it up on the screen here.
Is that okay?
That's great. Thank you.
just to remind you, this is being recorded. But actually it's a recording you'll be hearing, so not to worry. So tomato gardening in Marin County. Just again, I'm a Marin Master Gardener from 2012 to 2020, and then in Washington State, 2022 to the present. I have had vegetable and native plant gardens, Marksburg, Tiburon, also in Seattle and Bellevue, Washington. And I teach master gardener classes, fire-resistant landscapes, spring, summer, and winter vegetables, tomatoes, asparagus, and I forgot citrus. So let's start. What are we trying to accomplish with this class? I'd like you to understand the basic principles of tomato gardening and the trade-offs, and learn how to plan and plant a tomato crop, learn how to care for them, harvesting and storage, and problem diagnosis. The context for this, again, is a sustainable gardening approach, which you could net out to. We're trying to minimize the use of chemicals and fertilizers and maximize our ability to preserve our natural resources and maintain plant and diversity health. And this is occurring during climate change. And so your tomato gardening is affected by climate change, and there'll be a couple of specific points where I'm going to say, watch for this, watch for that. But overall, what we need to be very aware as master gardeners, particularly when you're working in any sort of help desk mode or at an event or with the public on the help desk itself, is we might begin to see new problems we haven't seen before. So you have to be current with the science, paying attention, because we may end up changing practices over the next 10 years. In fact, I almost guarantee you we will. So tomatoes are part of the Solanaceae family, which is the nightshade family, which includes bell and chili peppers, potatoes, eggplant, tomatillo, and tobacco. The reason you need to be aware of this is when we get to crop rotation, rotating within a family does you no good, because these vegetables and the Solanaceae family tend to have similar diseases and insect problems. So if you just swap these out in the same area year to year, you will be continuing the problems that you've had. So we'll get to that on crop rotation, but this is the family. There are a series of sort of splits that I need you to get into your head, because when you're trying to help people or you're trying to do this yourself, these take you down different paths. So the first split is, does someone want to grow heirlooms or hybrid tomatoes? If it's an heirloom, that means open pollinated, you can save the seeds from year to year, and they're valued for their taste. If it's hybrid, they've been crossbred, so you can't save the seeds. And usually they've been created for a particular purpose, which could be disease resistance or shipping or long lives on a shelf. So these tend to be two different decisions someone can make. The second decision that someone can make is between a determinant and an indeterminate. Now, determinants were developed so that farmers could have a crew or a combine come through a field on a given day in the summer and pick all the tomatoes, and everything was uniformly ripe and at roughly the same size. These tend to be bush tomatoes, smaller in form factor, and they push a crop out. Now, there might be a second crop later, but it's primarily a one push thing. And it's great for agriculture because you can schedule it. You know when roughly X weeks in advance you're going to be in the field harvesting this tomato crop. An indeterminate is different. Once you plant it, it starts going to flower. It continues to go to flower for weeks and weeks and weeks. So you can have a crop that starts at the end of July that you're still harvesting in October. And they tend to be bigger plants. So, and this, by the way, this determinate, indeterminate has nothing to do with size or hybrid versus heirloom. These are two different approaches. The indeterminate almost always needs scaffolding because they grow taller. And they have a longer harvest cycle. And so you're harvesting some of the tomatoes at any given time, but not all of them because they're in this ripe to unripe stage. Oh, one last thing here. People who have containers or are in contained small spaces, terminates tend to be a better solution because it's physically a smaller plant. People who have more space and trellising, an indeterminate does well. Both can be done in containers, but an indeterminate needs much more space. Another thing to bear in mind is when you look at a seed packet, it will have something called DTM or days, which is measured when the plant is planted into the ground. So if you start a plant from seed in a cup and then transfer it, this is how long from that point of being transferred as a start before they would expect the harvest. This is wildly unpredictable. This is a shot. If you had perfect conditions and nothing changed, this is roughly when it should happen. It is indicative, though, and I'll get into this more later, of how long it's going to take before you can harvest. And the longer it takes to harvest, the more risk you have as a gardener. So there's a point to having some shorter days to maturity varieties, mid-range and long, so that you're starting to see some tomatoes in July, more in August, more in September. And the days to maturity are the thing to watch. But it doesn't mean the days from when you put the seed in the cup with the soil. It means from when you transplant the start into the ground. So fruit types, they're small, salad, standard, beefsteak, paste, and currant. This spectrum, again, the larger the fruit, the longer it takes. And so if you are in a cooler climate, you will want shorter days to maturity, so you have a better chance of getting fruit during the summer. There are also some specialties like the paste tomato, the San Marzano and others. These grow for a very specific purpose. Or, for example, the standard size or the salad, these are ones that most people can grow. Beefsteak takes some work. It's larger. Likewise, currant are smaller than cherry tomatoes, have very intense flavor, but they're kind of a pain to harvest because there's like picking berries. So when you're talking to someone, your splits were, do you want heirloom or hybrid? Determinate or indeterminate, and now fruit types. Overwhelmingly in tomatoes, place drives choice of plant. The first question to ask someone is, what is the climate where you grow your tomatoes? And in Marin, we break them into two camps: the warmer climates, the hot climates, and the cool coastal climates. Then the question is, where are you planting them? In ground, raised beds, or containers? Then what size of tomato are you trying to grow? And then what type? You have these four sets of questions, though in fact, most of the time when people approach me, they start with, I want to grow heirlooms, and I'd like to grow beefsteaks. And oh, by the way, I'm doing them in containers on my deck and I only get 4 hours of sunlight. We'll get into this. But if you understand these four variables, most importantly is climate. What's the climate where you're growing the tomatoes? So for example, let's take 20 different varieties of tomatoes, and this could be similar to the chart that you're going to get for the tomato market each year. You'll have a list of tomatoes, and you'll be able to see, sorry, I have this Zoom thing in the way. Some do well in containers, some do well in coastal cool climates, some are heirlooms, some are hybrids, and then they have sizes. So I create a chart like this, or you'll get one from the tomato market. And this gives you a set of choices to make. So, for example, if someone lives in a coastal cool climate, like Mill Valley, like West Marin, then you want to say, out of this list of 20, here are the 3, 6, 12, I think 9 or 10 or 12 that do well in coastal cool climates. So let's focus there. It doesn't mean you couldn't grow a hot climate tomato. The question is, can it fully ripen? And we'll get to full size. So the trade-off between coastal cool and warm climate tomatoes in a coastal cool climate is ripeness and size. The second thing someone might say to you is, because you've asked them, oh, I'm growing in containers. You go, okay, of that coastal cool climate list, here are the 7 that do well in containers. Now you constrain the list further. But now if you notice, there's some cherries, there's a beefsteak, and there's some medium-sized tomatoes. And you have a choice between heirloom and hybrid tomatoes. You've covered pretty much the waterfront of what people might want, but what you've gotten them to do is focus in on where they're growing, coastal cool, and in a container, not in ground or raised bed. In any given zone, for that zone, everything grows in a raised bed or in ground. It's the container that constrains your list of tomatoes. Does that make sense? I hope it does. So the next thing is, when you're thinking about in ground or raised beds or containers, they all have different strengths and weaknesses and issues for growing tomatoes. So the picture on the left is the traditional in-ground with straw mulch between the rows. Raised beds in the middle, you'll notice it's a wood form and plantings, and then a row of containers on a deck. But before we get into that, the most critical thing about growing tomatoes is what you're really doing is growing a root system. So let me explain. This research is, believe it or not, from Russia, where they like to grow tomatoes, but they have a very short growing cycle. So in the left picture here, 4 weeks after a start has been transplanted into the field, this is in ground, it has a root structure that is about 3.5 to 4 feet wide by a little more than 2 feet deep. At 10 weeks, 6 weeks later, it's 2, 4, 6, 7 feet wide and 4 feet deep. And this is because the tomato is looking for water and nutrients. And it's very efficient at growing roots at the beginning of its life cycle to create the nutrient mass it needs to then grow flowers and fruit. So when you're thinking about a raised bed or a container or in ground, the more space the tomato has to spread out, the healthier. So by definition, a raised bed can be pretty close to the same as in ground, but a container is a very different thing. So the varieties that are designed for containers grow more efficient root systems, but less extensive. Soil amendments. Compost and organic 555 fertilizer are essential because tomatoes are very heavy feeders. So when you're preparing your soil, you want to have taken out in the fall your old plants. If you wintered over with a cover crop, great. You need to have cleared that out about a month in advance of planting. You want to have put in a layer of compost and let it sit for 3 or 4 weeks. And then when you go to plant, put and check the quantities on the fertilizer that you've bought. But when you go to put the plant in, put a tablespoon or whatever underneath the plant, between the bottom of the plant and the roots going out, and mix it into the soil so that the roots are growing out into the fertilizer space where the nutrients will be. And then, depending upon how your garden's configured, you want to put mulch on top to reduce weeds and preserve moisture. So the order of battle is a month in advance of planting. Make sure you've gotten rid of all the weeds, put in the compost, and do not turn the soil. Do not double dig. You don't want to destroy soil structure. When you plant, add fertilizer at the bottom of the hole and mix it in, and then cover the bed with mulch if you want to reduce weeds and preserve water. So this is very critical because no one's soil is perfect. And this boosts the nutrient value right before you plant. The tomatoes can be really wonderful plants. They can also be a shade wall that blocks the sun getting to the plants behind them. And they can also, if you plant 2 rows of tomatoes, the front row can block the back row. So if you're planting 2 rows, you want it to be on the north side of the garden. So if you have southern sun, the rest of the garden is to the sun side of the tomatoes, or on the west side, so that the garden is between, the rest of the garden is to the west of the plants. You want to stagger them so that your tomatoes don't line up perfectly and the back row doesn't get any sun. You want to snip off the bottom branches of the start so that 50% of the plant is going to get buried underground. You want to lay out your irrigation and test it after you've planted, put in your scaffolding, and stake your scaffolding down so that you make sure that you don't puncture your irrigation while you're putting in your scaffolding, and you don't put the scaffolding through the root system of a plant. So some people put the plants in and then wait to put in the irrigation, or wait to put in the scaffolding. And the problem is then there's a high probability of you causing a downstream problem. So what does that look like? Here's a normal start. It's about 8 inches tall. You're going to plant them 24 inches apart if they're determinants, 36 to 48 inches apart if they're indeterminates. You're going to stagger the rows, and you're going to pinch off these lower branches. And this plant is that brown, the picture here. This picture right here is this plant planted. So 1/2 to 2/3 is underground. The reason you're doing that is if you look closely at the stalk, the cilia on the stalk then becomes roots. So what you're doing is you're immediately doubling or tripling the root mass of the plant at the beginning. Now, if you get one of these plants sometimes where they're 12 or longer inches, you can pick off the lower branches, lay it on the side in a trench, and that will all become roots. The trick is make sure you remember how you did that so that when you put the stake in, you don't put the stake through the stem of the plant. In containers, big is better. 5-gallon is the minimum. I've done 15. The plant will take advantage of as much space as you give it. You want them, all of them, to have drainage holes And plastic means that you won't have as much evaporation. Terracotta and wood evaporate more. And I have in the past put plastic pots in terracotta pots so that you have the water being kept inside with the plant and you have the aesthetic of the outside terracotta or wood planter. But to optimize for how much water you have to use, plastic doesn't evaporate as much as other surfaces. The other reason you want drainage holes, but not the dishes, is tomatoes don't like wet feet, meaning their roots being wet. So if you are going to put them in a container, you want the water to drain away from the plant and the base of the container. And this brings us to irrigation. This is a rough scale, and you should pay attention as you move from left to right. At the beginning, in the first 3 or 4, 6 weeks of planting, you may be irrigating 3 times a week. You want the soil moist. It helps the nutrients transfer into the plant. But at some point, the plant starts to flower. And if you're buying a plant that's already flowering, I would suggest pinching it off until the plant's grown bigger. Because once it starts to flower, it's going to optimize for fruit production rather than plant growth. Once it starts to flower, you start to back off on the watering a little bit. So you go from 3 times a week to 1 to 2 times a week. And once you're in fruit, you're at once a week. What you're doing is you're stressing the plant. And as it goes to fruit, as the water becomes less available, it puts more effort into having the fruit because it's a survival mechanism. But the other thing it does is it increases the flavor of the fruit by having less water. So you're going to go from 3 times a week to 1 to 2 times a week to once a week. And you just have to pay attention watching your plants. Where are we in the cycle? Now, if you're in containers, you might have a variation on this, which is you might be watering more frequently but shorter durations, because once the water starts flowing out the bottom of the container, it's not doing you any good. So to conserve water, you might water more than 3 times a week at the beginning, but for much shorter periods. So just play with this. If you're in ground or in raised beds, this sequencing works. Once you go to containers, you need to, at the very beginning, start with how long can I run my water and how are my plants looking? Now, the other way to think about this is if you walk out at midday and your plants are drooping, don't worry about it. If you get up in the morning and they're drooping, they're not getting enough water. If you see a lot of cherry tomatoes splitting, they're either on the plant too long or they're getting too much water. So there are a bunch of problems within the watering space that just mean pay attention and deal with them as they arise. Was that okay? Now, scaffolding. In Marin County, in July and August, you can have windstorms. And if your scaffolding is not secured, your entire tomato crop can get blown over. It's happened to me. So I tend to have scaffolding that goes up 6 feet from the ground because I tend to grow indeterminates. I tend to have rebar into the ground and then attach my scaffolding, and I use basically this is called hog wire, but it's 4x4 squares. And you buy a 6-foot stretch, loop it around, tie it off, and now you have a cone that's 6 feet tall, about 3 feet in diameter. It's plenty of size for an indeterminate tomato. And then you put rebar and attach the cone to the rebar. You can also buy these triangular things. They tend to be shorter than I like. And in either case, the difference between tomatoes and say beans, beans have hands. So beans will go up a scaffolding and attach themselves. Tomatoes don't have any hands. So you need to tie them up as you go. And a figure 8 knot where you've got, it's around the stake or the edge of the tomato cage, and then it's looped around the plant, and it needs to be a somewhat loose loop, A, because the plant's growing, and B, because it needs to move a little bit in the wind. So if you tie it tight, you're constraining the plant, and that will come back to bite you when the stalk gets bigger and now it can't grow anymore. So this is a really important part, scaffolding and tying. I go out once a week with my string or my ties, and I just look at every single plant. And it's funny, in a week, a branch will have grown that you didn't see last time that needs to be tied up so that it's attached to the scaffolding. And you just keep at it. Now, tomatoes are self-pollinating. What that means is the flowers contain both the male and female parts, and they are vibrated by either wind or bees in order to release the pollen and have them move within the flower. There's a very specific frequency that this occurs at in terms of pitch. And if honeybees are unavailable, then bumblebees and other species can do this. We have had some seasons in Marin with pollination problems, either because something's happened to the bees or it wasn't windy. So if you get to July and your flowers are browning and falling off, that's because of a pollination problem. And there's not a lot you can do about it. So if the temperatures get too high too early, that affects the pollen. Humidity can also affect the pollen. But if you see in this photo, this brown flower, that's an unpollinated flower. That's your problem. Now, pruning. We used to talk a lot about pruning tomatoes. And as you'll see later, the science is starting to tell us be conservative on this. So here in this picture, this is the main stalk. Here's a branch with a leaf, and in the elbow of the branch is a sucker. So these are what you do pinch off. That's it. Unless you have a tomato plant that's growing out the top of your scaffolding to where you can't reach it anymore, in which case you may want to top it. But otherwise, you want the leaf canopy because it transfers sun into energy and sugar for the plant, and it shelters the tomatoes and it reduces sun scald. So if you over prune your tomato, it reduces the energy that it's receiving and increases sun scald. So it's just something that's changed in the last 10 years. Likewise, harvesting. Truly the only way to know if you have ripe tomatoes is to go out into the garden and taste them. Saves a lot of time. So I start sort of hovering 60 to 85 days after the seedlings go in and looking for how they feel in your hand and whether they just fall off into your hand when you grab them. If you start to see cherries cracking, they've been on the vine too long. But by and large, I just look for the color, the feel, and whether it just comes off in your hand on the vine. So let me do a brief diversion. I think the reason people grow tomatoes, and it's very popular, is they like the flavor of a fresh tomato. And if you get this question, it's a complicated question. And the research has only started in the last decade into this area. But let's talk about it. So what is flavor? Flavor is the taste in your mouth and throat of what you're eating. And olfaction, which is the sense of smell. And I would also argue how it looks. So what happens is taste and olfaction, your brain is connecting the two and saying, oh, this is this flavor. But it's happening because of different inputs. Now, the problem is that most breeders focus on yield, disease resistance, and firmness, which are essential for shipping, and didn't care about flavor. And only in the last decade has the growth of heirloom tomatoes has happened. Mainstream big ag is trying to understand how to have a more flavorful tomato. There's just one problem, and this is this wonderful article in Science magazine. Preference tests. You give a group of people the same tomatoes from the same place. Men and women don't agree. Foodies and non-foodies don't agree. Older and younger people don't agree. And the same fruit in different regions, people don't agree. And so the science is limited because of the nature of the people who are testing. But what we can generalize about flavor-driven fruit selection is the smaller the fruit, the higher the flavor. And specifically in the case of cherries, it's because of the sugar content. So you can look at a cherry tomato and a beefsteak, and a cherry will have higher sugar content. The color of fruit, the research is not clear on that it actually changes the taste, but it changes what you see, and that may change what you think you perceive. Foliage is hugely important because that's what captures sunlight. So plants with dense, healthy foliage can convert more sunlight into sugar and other flavorful components than one with less foliage. They suspect this may be one of the reasons that heirlooms are more flavorful because they tend to have more leaves. And then within hybrids itself, smaller fruit and determinants seem to have more flavor than larger fruit and indeterminates. So how do you grow a flavorful tomato? You want very rich soil, compost with potassium and sulfur added. You want to water sparingly, because remember, the more water in the fruit, the less flavor. The more sunlight, the better. And you want temperatures between 80 degrees in the day and 50 and 60 degrees at night. This is not something you can control. But if you know you're going into a heat wave, you might want to put out either patio umbrellas or shade cloth for your afternoon sun, which is the most intense sun. So that's the flavor component. I hope that was helpful. It's a moving target, and there'll be more research in the coming years, and this will grow. But when you talk to home gardeners, they're trying to optimize for flavor. And let me just hit one last point. What's the best time to eat a tomato? Right after you pick it. That is the peak of its flavor. Now, its color may change if you leave it on a shelf, but its flavor is declining. So what you want to do is you don't want to refrigerate tomatoes. You want to pick them and eat them as soon as possible. So the time from plant to table, the shorter that is, the higher the flavor. So common tomato problems. We have environmental disorders. We have blossom end rot, cat facing, fruit cracks, sun scald, tomato leaf roll. We have a host of diseases, and then we have pests. What you all need to do as master gardeners is teach people how to use IPM. Because if they just keep coming back to you over and over again, wanting you to answer their questions, then we failed. What we really need to do is empower people to go to IPM, click on the home and garden section, pick the vegetable that we're looking at, and then get the answers to their questions. And let me go back. What's important is for each one of these, if you're taking a sustainable gardening approach, what you're trying to do is minimize pesticide and herbicide use and maximize sustainable gardening practices. So in IPM, it will say non-chemical management, chemical management. Start in the non-chemical and walk people through doing that first before trying chemical. So I hope this was helpful. If you need further resources, they're at the back of the book, particularly for the flavor component. And I hope you have a great summer growing tomatoes in Mill Valley and the rest of Marin County. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Wow, that was great, right?
Yeah.
So let me thank you so much, Alison. So let me share the screen so we can then get Cinda to do the next part of our presentation, which is about our next grouping of Master Gardener projects. And we call these are the internal communications themes projects, which we also call the In Your Jammies projects. So with that, I will cede to Cinda.
Well, hi, everybody. It's good to be back. And I think this week there's a lot of things that you'll really want to know about, because this first one, MatchMG, is a wonderful resource to you as you continue onward in Master Gardeners, because this is our internal newsletter to you. You'll get it once a month online. And this gives you quick updates on who needs help, what are the things that are going on that you could get involved with. And I check this all the time to see where I could be useful or what I might be interested in. It takes somebody to run it. So this is a volunteer job that someday you might aspire to, because you do it entirely from home. And it's something that helps other master gardeners. And you send out an announcement once a month or so, and just ask people if they have any updates. And then when they send them in, there's a special thing that you put them on, so constant comment. And then you can do this email that you see in the slide. And it's just a really easy way for master gardeners to connect with the person in charge, check it out, find out more about projects, and then get involved. So this is a wonderful job. And the person who does it says, it might just take 1 to 3 hours a month. And that's definitely a good at-home job. Now, another one that's a little more extensive is the row by row newsletter. And you may have already seen that. This is a great way to learn about what's going on in Master Gardeners. Again, it comes right to your email box. You don't have to do anything. It just arrives. And the person who's in charge of it, once a month, sends something out to all the project leaders and just says, do you have something? And if you do, it needs to be in by the 20th of the month. And then this person assembles all of that and puts it together to mail at the end of the month. So again, something that is useful to you. And if you ever want to get involved, it's a way you can be super helpful to other master gardeners, but you can do it all from home. All right, there's another one that I'm sure you're already familiar with. So this one, VMS, is a really important piece of Master Gardeners because it gives us so much information online. And there's a team that needs to be involved in this. So you don't do it all by yourself. But again, it's a good one that you can do from home. You learn a lot about Master Gardeners because the website covers everything. So you're sort of working with lots of pieces of the organization, updating it, refining it. And it's something that we've been given by UC, and it's how we track our hours, etc. And speaking of tracking your hours, I got in the habit of tracking just about every day that I did something. And that way I never had to worry about counting at the end of the year. Have I done enough? So I found VMS really useful for me just to check on my hours and get them in. I could sign up for events, and I hope that you'll continue to explore it. I'm always finding new things on here. There are documents and program descriptions. So there's lots of information that's useful to you. And this is something that you might aspire to because you can work at home and help other master gardeners get all this information too. And there's one more announcements. Okay, this one's less intense. Maybe you've already gotten an announcement in your mailbox. Two people work on this together. It's something that needs a team because you need to check in every day to see if somebody has sent you an announcement that needs to be published. But it might only take up to 4 hours a month to do this. So this is a rather easy at-home job. You could do lots of other things in addition. I think this is one, again, where having some computer skills helps. But you know, if you're interested in it, I'm sure you can get trained just so that you could help in this way. And I hope you're all going to be looking for announcements this spring, because I think some of the projects will be sending out information about after you've graduated, you can come to some kind of an orientation for a project and learn more about it and see if you want to get involved. I know Exploring Habitats is having something on May 7th, midday, and that's after your graduation. You could come over to the Marin Art and Garden Center. You could find out more about Exploring Habitats, and that will be sent out as one of these announcements. So you'll know you could sign up. And I'm going to put in a plug in for right afterwards also on May 7th in the afternoon. You could double dip because the advanced training people are having a 1-hour tour at the Marin Art and Garden Center. So you could come for one thing, stay for the next, and go away having learned a lot. And these internal communications are important to how we function. So they're behind the scenes, but really important. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And representatives from all of these will be at the project fair if you have questions that come up later.
I think we're good. Thank you, Cinda.
Well, thank you. That was quick, but I'm looking forward to next week, and I'll see you in person.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cinda. Okay, what's coming up next week? Hip hip hooray! Homework 12, the final one is due. We have the April 4th class in person at Hamilton. Please bring your completed GPP binder with you to our in-person class next week. This will be a chance for you to take about an hour or so when we finish our session on climate to meet in small groups to share insights about the GPP process, what your project entails, what your vision is, what plants, elements you're excited about, etc. Nothing formal, just going to have a chance to explain the whole process that you went through and the outcome. If you have not completed all aspects of your GPP, please have them cover everything, finish by next week. We are going to spend some time at the end of the class talking about graduation and what you all want to do for your graduation. I am not in charge of the graduation. I will need about 15 or 20 minutes, which you can put me in where you would like, because hopefully at the beginning, because you will be able to bring alcohol to your graduation. I need to take time to thank some of the people that have helped me, like the TAs, etc. So I do need that time, but everything else that you want to be doing is up to you. There's usually a statement by David, I think, Carol. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, so usually they're, the co-presidents will make a little bit of, they'll make a little congratulations, you've made it across the finish line. David Lewis will also usually make a few remarks. So yeah, Melissa will be able to sort of bracket out sort of the general flow, like, what time they need in the beginning. And then it usually is open to you all to design if you want to have like class song, or you want to get up and do sort of little mini awards to each other, or whatever you want to do. So
the March evaluation will be sent via email after today's class. Once again, I recommend that you fill it out. It will be a useful tool for the upcoming VP of training and the trainers and myself for any adjustments in April. The class final will be posted after next week's class. You will have 3 weeks to complete your final. You will submit it in person at our last class, the project fair. We do need it in person. We do need We do need a paper form, because what we do is we have a meeting where we grade the finals, a group of people. So we do need that in person, not on a computer. Remember that this is an open book assessment, but do not copy and paste your answers. They need to be in your own words, and they should come from readings and presentations, and to a smaller extent, the online video content. Also, the expectation is that each of you independently prepares all responses. You can certainly have study groups, and we encourage that but we do encourage that you respond to each question yourself, and then it's totally open to study groups. Your homework assignments and homework keys are vital resources that should definitely be used as a source for studying. With the exception of today's presentation, all of the class presentations are now updated in CT. In several instances, Patrick was holding off on posting until the presenters sent us updated slides to avoid multiple copies of the same document floating around. There were only 3 classes where this was an issue, and each one of those presenters was also a presenter last year. We reviewed the content and found that the content remains the same between classes. So Patrick posted the 2023 presentations to CT in these 3 cases. These are clearly noted in CT. If you are concerned, if you have questions, please reach out to Patrick or me.
And I just want to add, and Alison, I'll let Patrick know that I basically took away your ability to take notes on your computer today. So when he's been able to upload it to CT, then I'll make sure that you know that, so that then you can then be able to write it again or review it again and take your notes like you normally do. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you again, Allison. I do want to point out an addendum to the issue with the presentations. I think I have sent emails to these presenters 3 or 4 times requesting it and have gotten no response. So that left us with the choice of going back to 2023. I also noted as I was chatting, if the homework keys are going to be posted on to CT. I don't think we did that last year. You should have had all the homework keys sent to you through your TAs. If you don't have all your homework keys, please reach out to them. I think that would be a good idea rather than posting all the homework keys. If that's inconvenient, let me know, all of you, and I will talk to Patrick about posting them, or maybe I will just download and send them to you. But you should have them throughout the year. One of the issues, or one of the things about presenting your homework to the TAs, was that if you did do your homework, then they sent you the homework key.
Right.
So I am going to close the garden gate. No one is more cherished in this world than someone who lightens the burden of another. I'm seeing Allison is sending me that she did not get the homework key. Please send me emails if you do not get homework keys from your TAs. I'd like to address that with the TA, so if they continue on next year, that won't happen again. And let me know what ones that you haven't received. They may be totally unaware of that you did not get a homework, and I will make sure that we get all the homework keys to you. That will be my goal. Are there any further questions for the day?
Nice to see you all again.
I'm going to reclaim host, Carol.
Okay, that sounds great.
Okay, I just did that supposedly.
All right, well, thank you all. So
thank you.
And we appreciate you dealing with my glitches on Zoom today. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn off the recording now. Take care.
And there were no glitches.